Why you wouldn't last a day in ancient Egypt. The daily grind of the Nile River civilization. Ancient Egypt is often romanticized in modern culture. Pyramids, pharaohs, and grand temples come to mind, evoking images of a powerful civilization full of majesty and mystery. However, to truly understand life in ancient Egypt, one must strip away the myths and take a hard look at the everyday reality of living in this ancient civilization. While Egypt's legacy is one of architectural wonders and spiritual significance, the daily life of the common people was far less glamorous. From the laborers working on monumental construction projects to the farmers tending crops along the Nile, life in ancient Egypt was dictated by the rhythms of the river and the demands of a society that depended heavily on order and discipline. The people of ancient Egypt lived in a world where survival was never guaranteed. Despite the grandeur of the pharaohs and the elite class, the majority of Egyptians were farmers, laborers, and artisans. Most of them worked from sunrise to sunset, dealing with the hot sun, the labor-intensive tasks, and the demands of a society that operated on the basis of a rigid class system. If you found yourself in ancient Egypt, it wouldn't take long before you would realize how much more challenging daily life was than what we often envision. Let's start with the basics. The very land that made Egypt so famous, the Nile River. The Nile was both a blessing and a challenge. While it provided fertile soil for agriculture, it was also unpredictable. Each year, the Nile would flood, enriching the land with nutrients, but the flooding could also be damaging if it was too high or too low. The river's seasonal changes dictated when crops were planted and harvested, but it also determined how much food the people could grow. A poor flood season could mean famine, while a generous flood could provide enough for the people, and even some to be sold as surplus. Living along the Nile meant that for the majority of people, farming was the backbone of survival. While the pharaoh and his royal court enjoyed an abundance of food and luxury, the everyday Egyptian was heavily reliant on crops such as wheat, barley, and flax. These crops were used for bread, beer, a staple drink for Egyptians, and linen. It was rare for someone to live a comfortable life in the countryside without working the land, and even more so for anyone to avoid the grueling work. Most farmers lived in small mud brick houses that offered little protection from the elements. These homes were often basic, with dirt floors and simple furniture made from reeds. The work itself was physically demanding and involved tending to the fields, irrigating the land, and maintaining the tools and infrastructure needed for crop production. Even children were expected to contribute, whether by herding animals or assisting with planting. Children in rural areas, especially, didn't have the luxury of education, with many learning only what was necessary for their survival. The labor on the great temples and monumental construction projects like the pyramids was similarly grueling. Contrary to popular belief, the pyramids weren't built by slaves but by a well-organized workforce of skilled laborers and seasonal workers, many of whom came from farming communities when the flood season made it impossible to tend to crops. This massive labor force would work long hours in the harsh Egyptian sun, hauling limestone and sandstone blocks to construct the towering structures. Conditions were not only physically taxing but dangerous as well. Accidents were frequent, and workers' health was often compromised by the extreme heat, lack of water, and poor living conditions. The elite class in Egypt lived a different life, of course. The pharaoh, priests, and nobles had access to vast amounts of food, luxury goods, and comfort. They lived in grand homes and enjoyed leisure activities like hunting, feasting, and entertaining. However, their lives were also regulated by the duties of governance, religion, and war. For example, the pharaoh was considered both a political leader and a living god, tasked with maintaining order, and appeasing the gods. It was a life of immense responsibility, as the well-being of the entire civilization was believed to rest on the pharaoh's shoulders. But even the elite were not free from the daily grind. They had to adhere to the rules of society and the demands of religion. The Egyptians believed in a strict moral code, and everyone, from the lowest laborer to the highest priest, was expected to follow the teachings of the god. This made their society one of order and routine, where every day was regulated by the rise and fall of the sun, and actions were deeply connected to religious beliefs. Now, let's step back for a moment Imagine you were born into a commoner's life in ancient Egypt. From the start, you would learn how to navigate a world that operated not by individual choice but by a set of rigid laws and expectations. As a farmer or a laborer, you would spend your entire life working in the fields or on construction projects, rarely getting a day off, and certainly never experiencing the luxury of those at the top. Even the food you ate, often simple coarse bread, beer and vegetables, would be far removed from the feasts enjoyed by the elite. It was a life of hard work and limited opportunity. So with all this in mind, how long do you think you would last in such an environment, where every day was defined by exhausting labor and a society that offered little respite from the grind? The unseen struggles of daily life. Life in ancient Egypt was governed by cycles and routines that, while essential for the survival of the civilization, left little room for deviation or comfort for the majority of the population. Whether you were a farmer, a laborer, or a craftsman, your days would be shaped by the demands of the land, the river, and the gods. If you were born into this world, it was unlikely you would ever escape the harshness of daily labor or experience the luxury of the elite. For the majority of people, waking up in the morning was the beginning of a long day of hard work. The Egyptian day, like that of many ancient civilizations, was dictated by the natural rhythms of the environment. The sun, which baked the land, set the working hours, with the hottest parts of the day spent in relative rest. As a farmer, your work would begin early. Before the sun became unbearable, you would spend hours tending to crops, managing the irrigation systems that diverted water from the Nile to the fields, or gathering harvests during the season. This was a back-breaking job, often done with simple tools, and requiring both strength and endurance to face the hot, dry conditions. The life of a laborer, particularly one who worked on construction projects such as the building of temples or the pyramids, was just as grueling, if not more so. These monumental works were carried out under harsh conditions, where workers labored long hours in the burning sun, hauling heavy stones and blocks. Unlike modern construction workers, they didn't have cranes or mechanical tools. Everything was done manually. The physical toll was enormous, and while workers were paid and housed, the long hours, dangerous conditions, and lack of modern safety measures often meant that workers faced significant risks, from heat stroke to injury. The very idea of spending every day of your life performing labor like this without breaks or modern conveniences would leave you physically exhausted. But the physical demands of daily life were only part of the story. In ancient Egypt, the demands of religion and society were just as powerful, if not more so. Everything in the Egyptian worldview revolved around maintaining Ma'at, the concept of cosmic order and balance. This meant that, whether you were a laborer or a priest, you had a role to play in keeping the world in harmony. Each person, no matter their station in life, was expected to adhere to strict codes of behavior and morality. Failure to do so was believed to disrupt the balance of the universe and bring about chaos. This was particularly evident in the relationship between the people and the gods. The Egyptians were deeply religious, and their daily lives were infused with rituals and offerings meant to appease the gods and secure favor. In rural areas, daily offerings to local deities were part of the routine. In urban centers, large temples were the heart of religious activity, where priests performed elaborate ceremonies and offerings to the gods on behalf of the entire community. If you were a laborer or a farmer, you wouldn't have the luxury of simply enjoying a day off. You would have to make offerings to the gods before any work could begin, ensuring the crops or construction projects were blessed by the divine. But religion was not only something you participated in through rituals and offerings, it governed your thoughts, your social interactions, and even your dreams. The gods were constantly watching, and everything you did was believed to be monitored by divine forces. The Egyptians even had a detailed system of afterlife beliefs, where your deeds on earth would determine your fate in the afterlife. As a worker, it would be your duty to maintain order in your actions to ensure a favorable judgment when you passed away. This constant pressure to live according to divine will and social expectation would make any form of personal relaxation or rebellion almost impossible. It would be a life lived under constant scrutiny, both by the gods and by society. On top of these expectations, living in ancient Egypt meant dealing with the risks of disease, injury, and even death from harsh environmental factors. The Nile, while a source of life, also carried with it danger. Malaria, spread by mosquitoes that thrived in the marshy regions along the river, was common, and its toll on the population was severe. With no access to modern medicine, People lived with the constant threat of illness. Even minor injuries could prove fatal in a society without the advanced medical knowledge we take for granted today. You wouldn't be able to simply take a day off to rest if you were sick or injured. Work would continue, and the pace would remain unforgiving. The class divide, life in the shadow of the elite. As a common person in ancient Egypt, your life was also shaped by the rigid social structure that divided the rich and the poor, the elite and the laborers. The pharaoh, the god king, was at the very top of this structure. His rule was absolute, and all Egyptians, from the highest priest to the lowest farmer, were expected to honor and obey him. The pharaoh had immense power, not just politically, but also spiritually, as he was considered a god on earth. Below the pharaoh were the priests, who wielded great influence and were responsible for performing rituals and maintaining the temples. They were closely connected to the gods, and their status was highly revered. The priests' lives were far more comfortable than the commoners. They lived in large homes, wore fine clothing, and had access to the best food and medical care. They enjoyed a lifestyle far removed from that of a laborer or farmer. The elite class, which included nobility and wealthy landowners, also lived in luxury. They had large estates, feasted on fine foods, and enjoyed entertainment such as music, dance, and games. This was a stark contrast to the lives of the workers, who often lived in small, cramped homes made from mud brick. The gulf between the elite and the common people was wide, and the elites had the luxury of time, safety, and access to resources that the average Egyptian could never hope to experience. Yet even those in the upper echelons of Egyptian society were not free from the pressures of daily life. While they didn't have to toil in the fields or on construction sites, they had to maintain their wealth and status. Nobles were often tasked with overseeing large estates, which required constant management. The life of a wealthy Egyptian may have seemed more comfortable than that of a laborer, but it was still filled with responsibilities and expectations. Furthermore, much like the pharaoh, the elite class was expected to adhere to religious customs and play their part in maintaining Ma. Even the elite could not escape the influence of the gods in their daily lives. But despite the disparities in wealth and comfort, the lives of the common people were not entirely bleak. The social system in ancient Egypt, while rigid, was also somewhat flexible in terms of personal advancement. Many Egyptians worked their way up the social ladder through their skills or service to the pharaoh. For instance, a skilled artisan could rise to prominence and achieve a comfortable lifestyle. However, this upward mobility was rare, and for the vast majority of people, life remained a daily struggle for survival. The grim reality of death and the afterlife. Another aspect of life in ancient Egypt that would make survival difficult is the concept of death and the afterlife. For the ancient Egyptians, death was not an end but a transition to another world. The afterlife, known as the Field of Reeds, was a place where one's soul would continue to exist in peace, provided they had lived a righteous life and had followed the rituals and laws set forth by society. However, access to the afterlife was not guaranteed. The judgment of the dead, presided over by Osiris, the god of the afterlife, was a process that required one to prove their worthiness. The heart of the deceased would be weighed against the feather of Maut, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was found to be heavy with sin, it would be devoured by the monstrous Ammon, and the soul would be lost forever. For those in ancient Egypt, death was a constant concern. The fear of an unworthy judgment was as pervasive as the fear of physical death itself. The living worked to secure their place in the afterlife, whether through offerings, prayers, or elaborate burial rituals. Tombs were adorned with inscriptions and paintings, depicting the deceased's life and the hopes for a safe journey to the next world. This constant focus on the afterlife could be seen as both a comfort and a burden. It meant that every action in life was guided by the desire for divine approval, and that there was little room for personal desires or dreams. For the common Egyptian, life was a series of obligations, both earthly and spiritual, that left little space for relaxation or individuality. The long shadow of ancient Egypt's legacy. As we come to the final chapter of life in ancient Egypt, it's important to reflect on how the civilization's structure, culture, and daily challenges shaped not only those who lived through it, but also the broader legacy they left behind. If you were to live a day in ancient Egypt, it's not just the grueling labor or the harsh realities of class division that would leave their mark on you. It's the pervasive weight of a society driven by religion, order, and the eternal quest for the afterlife. The role of religion in shaping society. Religion in ancient Egypt was not something you could escape, nor was it something you could choose to ignore. It dictated every part of life, from your occupation to your relationship with others, and most importantly, your chances of surviving the afterlife. For the common people, religion was woven into the fabric of daily existence. There were gods for everything: Horus, the god of the sky; Osiris, the god of the afterlife; Ra, the sun god; and Anubis, the god of mummification. Every natural event, from the flooding of the Nile to the appearance of the morning star, was seen as a divine act, and people were expected to understand their role in maintaining the harmony of the world. If you were living in ancient Egypt, this would likely be one of the first things you noticed: the overwhelming presence of religious practices. Your daily routine would involve a series of rituals to appease the gods, from offering food at your local temple to paying respect to the deities associated with your family and community. Every home had its own small altar where incense and offerings were made regularly, and you would constantly be reminded of the invisible forces that shaped your life. If you were a farmer or a laborer, you wouldn't have the luxury of forgetting the gods even in your work. Your crops were expected to grow, thanks to the blessing of Osiris, and the fertility of your land was attributed to the Nile's annual flooding, a process that was seen as guided by the gods. Even your work on the construction sites for the pharaoh's grand temples was done in homage to the gods. They were the patrons of civilization itself, and their favor determined your fate on earth and in the afterlife. Imagine then, living under the constant pressure to honor gods you could neither see nor speak to, but who were believed to have the power to determine not just the quality of your harvest but the outcome of your life and death. The everyday Egyptian did not get to step outside the sphere of divine expectation. Your life was not just a labor for sustenance but a constant attempt to appease the gods and secure a place in the afterlife. The afterlife, the ultimate goal and constant fear. In ancient Egypt, the afterlife was everything. It wasn't just a religious concept, it was an inescapable truth that every person was constantly preparing for. The idea of death was never far from the minds of the Egyptians, and the fear of not being able to reach the afterlife loomed over the living. As a common person, you would spend your life preparing for the journey after death. For the elite, the process was grand and meticulous. Their tombs were filled with riches, food and offerings, meant to accompany them on their journey to the afterlife. However, for commoners, the preparation was less about luxury and more about following the prescribed rituals to ensure a successful passage into the afterlife. You would spend years learning the proper prayers and incantations to recite upon your death, because it wasn't just the gods who would decide your fate, it was also your own adherence to the ancient rituals of burial, offerings, and religious observance. In the final moments of your life, if you were to succumb to illness or old age, you would be carefully embalmed and mummified, preserving your body for eternity. The mummification process was a long and expensive one, but it was the ultimate safeguard to ensure your body would be intact for your journey to the field of reeds, the Egyptian version of paradise. Imagine the psychological toll this would take, knowing that your entire life was a preparation for a future that might never come if you failed to adhere to the rules. If you were not properly mummified, or if your soul was judged unworthy, you would be cast into darkness, your soul devoured by the demon Amit, and you would be denied the pleasures of the afterlife. This constant fear of an uncertain death, and the pressure to meet the high standards of religious observance, would weigh on your shoulders every single day. Daily life in the shadow of the pharaoh. At the top of this religious and social structure stood the pharaoh. As the living god of Egypt, the pharaoh's role was to maintain the balance of order, justice, and cosmic harmony. The pharaoh was the bridge between the gods and the people, and every action he took was seen as divinely inspired. However, as a common person, you wouldn't have much interaction with the pharaoh. Your life, while influenced by the decisions of the pharaoh and his priests, was centered more around the community and the daily grind. The pharaoh's grand building projects, whether they were temples, pyramids, or monuments to his reign, were realized by the labor of thousands of workers. These projects, though monumental in their achievement, were built at the cost of countless lives and immense human suffering. If you were one of the workers tasked with building the pyramid, your life would be defined by the physical hardship of the work, the long hours in the desert heat, and the constant supervision by overseers. The pyramids were meant to honor the pharaoh's divinity, but they also served as reminders of the power and might of the ruling class. As a laborer, you had no choice but to contribute to these constructions, as your status in society dictated that your life was in service to the pharaoh's divine rule. If you were a craftsman, the situation might be slightly better, but the work still involved long hours and limited freedom. The artisans who worked on the temples and tombs of the pharaohs were respected for their skill but still lived under the constant supervision of their superiors. Even the elites, while enjoying luxuries, were not free from the pressures of the gods and the state. Every noble had to participate in temple rituals and be a part of the grand social machine that was Egypt. The unrelenting demands of religion, the constant fear of failure in the afterlife, the grueling labor, and the overwhelming presence of the pharaoh's power would make everyday life in ancient Egypt difficult for any commoner, particularly those without any form of privilege or protection. Even the elite, who lived in more comfortable conditions, were still bound by religious obligations and the expectations of their society. The legacy of ancient Egypt. Today, we look back at ancient Egypt as one of the world's greatest civilizations, known for its monumental achievements in architecture, art, and science. But the daily reality of life for most Egyptians was far from the grandeur we associate with the civilization. From the labor of the farmers who worked the land to the artisans who carved the pharaoh's tombs, every person in ancient Egypt played a part in maintaining the order of society and the favor of the gods. Imagine living in a world where every day was shaped by ritual, where your survival was as dependent on the gods as it was on your physical labor. The reality of life in ancient Egypt would have left little room for comfort, rest, or individuality. You would spend your days working, praying, and preparing for a death that was as inevitable as the Nile's flooding. Despite the grand monuments that rose from the desert, the lives of the common people were grounded in a daily struggle for survival, all in the shadow of the gods, the pharaoh, and the fear of what awaited in the afterlife. The Black Plague, when death came for Europe, the arrival of the pestilence. In the mid-14th century, Europe was on the brink of profound social, economic, and religious upheaval. What was once a thriving continent of bustling cities, vibrant trade routes, and a relative sense of stability was soon gripped by the terror of a disease that swept across nations, decimating entire populations. This was the Black Plague, a catastrophe that would shape European history in ways that are still felt today. The plague's arrival in Europe is shrouded in mystery, though it is believed to have originated in Central Asia. From there, it traveled westward, through trade routes, eventually reaching the shores of Europe via the bustling port city of Messina, Italy, in 1347. The disease, brought by merchant ships returning from the east, arrived with a deadly force. It was carried by fleas that lived on rats, the very animals that thrived on ships and in urban centers. The Black Plague wasn't simply one disease. It was a pandemic caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which manifested in three distinct forms: bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic. The first sign of the plague was its sudden, inexplicable nature. People would begin to experience fever, fatigue, and the swelling of lymph nodes, which would rapidly turn into buboes, painfully swollen lymph glands in the groin, armpits, or neck. As the disease progressed, some victims would develop black spots caused by internal bleeding, which is how the disease earned its infamous moniker. Those infected by the bubonic plague typically died within a few days, while the pneumonic form, which attacked the lungs, was even more lethal. The speed and brutality of the disease's progress left people desperate for answers, while also stirring a mix of fear, superstition, and religious panic. But it wasn't just the symptoms that made the plague terrifying. It was its overwhelming speed. Entire communities, from small villages to large cities, would be ravaged in a matter of weeks. The disease's transmission was fueled by the very trade networks that had made Europe so interconnected. Merchants traveling across the continent brought the plague with them, and the disease spread rapidly through the dense, unsanitary conditions of European cities, where people lived in close proximity to one another and to animals. People often had no idea how to stop the disease, and the lack of medical knowledge only made matters worse. Imagine yourself living in a medieval European town during this time. News of the plague's arrival would spread like wildfire, and soon the people in your community would begin to fall ill. There would be no understanding of germs or infection, and the disease's rapid spread would leave you wondering if you too might be next. In a time when life expectancy was already short and epidemics were not uncommon, the plague was a nightmare on an unparalleled scale. The streets would soon be filled with the cries of the sick and dying, and the number of bodies growing daily would overwhelm the meagre burial services of the time. The social fabric of Europe began to tear as cities were emptied out. In Florence, for example, it was reported that entire neighborhoods were abandoned as people fled, leaving their homes and businesses behind in a desperate attempt to avoid the disease. The cities, once lively and thriving, were transformed into eerily silent, desolate places. The plague forced families to abandon their loved ones, either because they were too sick to care for them or out of fear of becoming infected themselves. Entire villages were wiped off the map, and the once thriving trade routes that had bound Europe together were suddenly halted, leading to economic collapse in many regions. Would you, as a medieval European, be able to survive the Black Plague? Could you escape the fear that gripped the land? And could you find some way to protect yourself from the horror that seemed to come out of nowhere, claiming the lives of the young, the healthy, and the old alike? The Reign of Terror. As the Black Plague continued to spread across Europe in the 1340s and 1350s, entire communities were torn apart. The plague's devastating impact left no corner of Europe untouched, and its effects were felt far beyond the immediate toll on health. It not only killed millions, but also altered the course of history by disrupting social, economic, and religious structures. In the cities, the most immediate consequence of the plague was the collapse of urban life. Populations were decimated at staggering rates. In some cities, as much as 60–70% of the population perished within months. Families were torn apart, as fathers, mothers, children, and grandparents all succumbed to the disease, as people watched their loved ones die in agony, and in many cases without any medical intervention or understanding. A wave of panic swept through Europe. With no known treatment for the disease, and no understanding of how it spread, people turned to a mix of religion, superstition, and folklore in search of explanations and remedies. The religious authorities, unable to provide answers, began to tell people that the plague was a punishment from God. This idea was widespread, especially among the poorer classes, who were more likely to fall victim to the disease. The plague was seen as divine retribution for the sins of mankind. This led to an outpouring of religious fervor, with many turning to extreme penance in an effort to appease God. One of the most visible expressions of this was the rise of the flagellants, groups of religious zealots who would publicly whip themselves in self-punishment, hoping to purify themselves and avoid divine wrath. These public displays of suffering spread through many parts of Europe. Flagellants believed that by enduring physical pain, they could end the plague and bring about divine forgiveness. However, their actions were not always welcomed by religious authorities, who were worried that these unorthodox practices might undermine their own influence. Others, however, saw the plague not as divine punishment, but as the result of more earthly causes. There were many theories about how the disease spread, and as a result, people started to take extreme and sometimes misguided steps to avoid infection. Some turned to methods such as carrying aromatic herbs or anti-plague scents, believing that foul odors in the air were responsible for spreading the disease. Others sought refuge in isolation, locking themselves away in their homes or fleeing to the countryside. In some cases, entire villages would be abandoned, leaving behind only the dead. Among the most shocking and tragic responses to the plague was the outbreak of violent anti-Semitic sentiment. As Jews were often excluded from the broader Christian society, many communities wrongly blamed them for the plague. Jews were accused of poisoning wells or conspiring to spread the disease, and violent mobs attacked Jewish communities across Europe. Hundreds of Jewish men, women, and children were burned alive in the streets, and entire communities were wiped out by the violence that erupted. The brutality of these acts illustrated how, in times of crisis, fear and ignorance could quickly escalate into violence. While the physical toll of the plague was devastating, the social and economic upheaval it caused was just as profound. With so many people dying or fleeing to escape the disease, entire economies collapsed. Trade was severely disrupted, as merchants and traders were either killed or too fearful to continue business. Cities became ghost towns as workers died, leaving behind a huge gap in the labor force. This labor shortage, particularly in agriculture, meant that food production came to a standstill in many areas, and prices for basic goods skyrocketed. However, there was a paradox in this collapse. With fewer people left to work the land and produce goods, the survivors found themselves in a somewhat better position. The value of labor increased, and wages began to rise. For peasants and lower-class workers, the Black Plague opened up new opportunities. They were in higher demand, and often able to negotiate better pay and living conditions than they had before the plague. This shift in the balance of power between workers and landowners had long-term consequences. The social structure, which had once been rigidly divided, began to show signs of cracks. Yet, despite these potential gains for the lower classes, the overall economic impact of the plague was catastrophic. The sudden disappearance of large swaths of the population meant that trade networks collapsed, and many urban centers that had once thrived became empty shells. Cities that had been thriving centers of commerce and culture found themselves dealing with empty streets, abandoned buildings, and a loss of the labor force that had driven their economy. The plague led to a significant contraction in the economy that lasted for years, forcing countries to struggle with economic recovery. Even though the survivors had more bargaining power, the widespread devastation left Europe in a state of disarray. With so many people dead, families were left without breadwinners, and entire communities had to rebuild from the ground up. This resulted in widespread poverty, and for many, survival became a daily struggle. The psychological trauma of losing so many loved ones created lasting scars on the population, and the memory of the plague would linger for generations. As the disease receded and the worst of the pandemic seemed to pass, it became clear that Europe had been forever altered. The scale of the death toll was staggering, with estimates suggesting that between 25 and 50 million people perished across Europe, somewhere between a third and a half of the continent's population. The sheer scale of loss had far-reaching consequences, not just on the social fabric of Europe, but also on its cultural and religious structures. Would you have been able to survive the terror of the plague, or would you have succumbed to its horrors like so many others? How would you have navigated the confusion, fear, and grief that swept through your town as the disease took hold? Would you have found refuge in religious faith, in superstition, or in fleeing to the countryside? Rebuilding after the decimation. By the time the Black Plague had started to recede, Europe was a continent deeply scarred. The social, economic, and cultural structures that had previously defined much of European life had been irrevocably altered. With the population halved in many places, cities that had once thrived were now ghost towns, and the countryside was left with vast swathes of abandoned farms. But in the ashes of the destruction, new societal changes would take root, and the very foundation of Europe's future would be shaped by the aftermath of the plague, a world reborn. The demographic shift, the most immediate change to the European landscape after the plague, was the dramatic shift in population. With such a massive loss of life, up to 50% of the population in many places, the world of the survivors was fundamentally different. Entire villages disappeared, and rural life changed dramatically. As many of the laborers and peasants who had worked the land perished, the survivors found themselves in an entirely different position of power. For the first time in centuries, the balance of power began to shift. The labor shortage caused by the loss of workers led to higher wages for peasants and laborers, creating new opportunities for upward mobility. Previously, the rigid feudal system had kept the lower classes in their place, but now, landowners and aristocrats were forced to negotiate with peasants who had newfound bargaining power. This change in the labor market also meant that agricultural production could no longer rely on the same feudal obligations. It had to adapt to a more fluid, market-driven system. With fewer workers available to till the fields, peasants could often demand better pay or better living conditions. In some regions, this led to the rise of tenant farming, where peasants were no longer bound to a specific lord, but could work land for a share of the produce. This shift began the slow process of undermining the rigid social hierarchy that had been the cornerstone of medieval European society. It was a process that would take centuries, but the Black Plague marked the beginning of the end for the feudal system. This demographic change wasn't confined to the countryside. The cities, which had once been bustling with merchants, craftsmen, and other workers, faced massive labor shortages as well. In many urban centers, whole neighborhoods stood empty, with businesses closed and industries stunted. But in the wake of the plague, as populations began to stabilize, the cities slowly started to rebuild. The shift in labor dynamics meant that the workers who had survived had more autonomy, and the labor force, though smaller, was more mobile and in demand. Cities became spaces for innovation as new forms of economic and social structures began to take shape. Economic recovery, a long road ahead. Although the labor shortages led to better wages and living conditions for many workers, the overall economic recovery was slow. The trade networks that had once connected Europe were severely disrupted, and without workers to fill key roles in agriculture, industry, and commerce, it would take decades for cities and regions to return to any semblance of normality. For many areas, the recovery came in stages. The richest regions, those that were better connected to trade routes or had more resources, recovered faster. Cities such as Florence, Venice, and Paris, despite suffering under the plague, had the economic infrastructure to rebuild more quickly. However, many rural areas and smaller towns found it difficult to recover due to the persistent lack of workers and the decimation of local economies. The slow economic recovery also had social consequences, with entire villages abandoned and many areas depopulated. A great deal of land was left unworked. In some cases, surviving peasants and laborers were able to move onto this land, establishing new farms or businesses, but in many cases, it remained dormant, adding to the sense of loss that permeated Europe in the wake of the plague. The social fabric had been torn, and although the economic system began to stabilize, it would never be the same. Cultural shifts and the rise of new ideas. The aftermath of the Black Plague also had a profound effect on culture and intellectual life in Europe. The deep sense of loss and the existential crisis caused by the plague prompted a re-evaluation of European society. The religious authorities, who had failed to prevent or cure the plague, found themselves losing influence over a population that had been devastated by the loss of life. As the church struggled to provide answers, new ideas began to take root. The rise of humanism, which emphasized the value of individual experience and reason over religious doctrine, became more pronounced in the wake of the plague. People began to question established authority and sought to understand the world through science and reason, rather than solely through religious interpretations. The Renaissance, which would follow a few decades after the plague, was fueled by these shifts in thought. Artists, philosophers, and scientists began to explore new ways of thinking about humanity's place in the world, leading to a flourishing of art, literature, and scientific exploration. In the immediate aftermath of the plague, however, cultural life was muted, with so many institutions destroyed, and people still in mourning. It was a time of reflection. Yet, the rebirth that followed the plague was marked by a new approach to the arts and intellectual life. For many, the plague had shown how fragile life was, and this awareness led to a renewed appreciation for human achievement and the pursuit of knowledge. Religious transformation, crisis of faith and reformation. Religiously, the Black Plague also caused a crisis of faith. The Church's inability to explain or stop the plague led many to question the efficacy of religious authority. The Catholic Church had been the central institution in Europe, and its power had been largely unchallenged for centuries. Yet, the plague shook the foundations of its authority. Why, many asked, would God allow such suffering to befall humanity if the Church's teachings were true? In some places, this led to a turn toward more radical forms of spirituality. Some peasants, already dissatisfied with their status, began to view the plague as a sign that the Church and its leaders were corrupt. They sought out more localized folk traditions of healing and divination, questioning the power of priests and the established religious order. In more extreme cases, entire communities rejected traditional Christianity and embraced alternative spiritual beliefs. These questions would eventually culminate in the Reformation, a movement that began with figures like Martin Luther, who famously nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church in 15. Luther's criticisms of the Catholic Church, especially its indulgences and practices, were heavily influenced by the sense of disillusionment with the Church that grew out of the Black Plague's devastation. Though the Reformation wouldn't fully unfold until nearly a century later, the seeds of it were sown in the aftermath of the plague. The idea that religious authority should be questioned and that individuals could have a direct relationship with God started to take root in the wake of the plague's destruction. Legacy and reflection: how the plague changed the world. The Black Plague's aftermath didn't just mark the end of one chapter in European history, It laid the groundwork for the changes that would shape the modern world. The demographic shifts, the disruption of old economic systems, the rise of new religious and philosophical ideas, and the cultural transformations all set the stage for a Europe that was more dynamic, more open to change, and more prepared to embark on the age of exploration and discovery that would follow. However, the cost of the plague was staggering. The loss of life was beyond comprehension, and the psychological trauma it left behind would take generations to heal. The memory of the Black Plague haunted Europe long after it was gone, and the fear of another plague would loom over the continent for centuries. Yet, it also created space for new ideas, new social structures, and a more critical view of religious and political authority. If you had been living in Europe during the Black Plague, you would have faced unimaginable horror, but you would also have witnessed the beginning of a new age. How would you have survived the overwhelming fear and loss? And how would you have found hope in a world so drastically changed by death and disease? The fall of the Roman Empire. From glory to ruin. Deck. The rise of an empire. The Roman Empire, one of the most influential civilizations in history, was born out of a combination of conquest, politics, and military genius. From its beginnings as a small city-state on the banks of the Tiber River, Rome rose to dominate the Mediterranean and beyond, eventually controlling vast territories stretching from Britain to Egypt and from Spain to Mesopotamia. At its height in the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire was the most powerful state in the world, with a well-organized military, advanced infrastructure, and a sophisticated system of government. It was an empire built on the strength of its legions, the efficiency of its administration, and the vision of its leaders. The story of Rome's rise begins in the 8th century BC, with the legendary founding of the city by Romulus and Remus. Over the next several centuries, Rome would evolve from a monarchy to a republic, and then, in the 1st century BC, into an empire. But it was the shift from republic to empire that marked the beginning of Rome's transformation from a city-state to a global superpower. Rome's transition from a republic to an empire came in the wake of internal political instability and external military challenges. The Roman Republic, established in 509 BC, was characterized by a system of checks and balances, with elected officials and a senate guiding the affairs of the state. However, over time, this system became increasingly strained by power struggles between the Senate, military generals, and the rising elite class. The tension between the rich and the poor, coupled with the challenges of governing a rapidly expanding territory, eventually led to civil wars. One of the key figures in this transition was Julius Caesar, a brilliant military leader and politician. Caesar's rise to power was marked by his conquests in Gaul, his rivalry with Pompey the Great, and his eventual crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BC, which set off a civil war. After defeating his rivals and becoming the ruler of Rome, Caesar was appointed dictator for life. His rule, however, was short-lived. In 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators who feared his growing power. His death, however, did not lead to the restoration of the Republic, but rather to the rise of his adopted heir, Octavian, later Augustus, who would become the first Roman emperor. Augustus's reign, which began in 27 BC, marked the beginning of the Roman Empire. Augustus carefully consolidated power, positioning himself as the leader of the empire, while maintaining the illusion of republican governance. Under his leadership, Rome experienced a period of relative peace and prosperity known as the Pax Romana, Roman peace, which lasted for over 2 centuries. During this time, the empire expanded, infrastructure was improved, and Roman law and culture spread throughout the Mediterranean world. Rome's military strength was at the heart of its empire. The Roman legions, composed of highly disciplined soldiers, were the backbone of Roman power. These legions were responsible for both conquering new territories and maintaining order within the empire. The Roman army's success was not just due to its strength in battle, but also its organization, training, and infrastructure. Roads were built to move troops quickly, and fortifications were constructed to defend the empire's border. The empire also benefited from its sophisticated system of governance. Roman law, which was based on principles of justice, equality, and citizenship, provided a framework for administering vast territory. The Romans were skilled at integrating conquered peoples into the empire, granting them citizenship and allowing them to retain certain aspects of their local customs. This ability to create a sense of unity within diversity was one of the key reasons for Rome's success. But as the empire grew, so did its challenges. While the Roman Empire was strong and unified in its early years, it would not take long for the seeds of its decline to be planted. The vast size of the empire became a burden, making it difficult to maintain control over distant provinces. As the centuries passed, the Roman Empire faced increasing pressure from both internal and external sources. And while the empire continued to flourish, under a series of capable emperors, the stage was being set for its eventual fall. The cracks begin to show by the 3rd century AD. The Roman Empire, once united under the leadership of powerful emperors, began to show signs of serious internal strain. The empire, now vast and stretching from the British Isles to the Near East, was facing challenges that threatened its very foundations. The once formidable Roman military, which had been the heart of the empire's expansion and dominance, began to experience difficulties, both in terms of its ability to defend the borders and maintain internal stability, political instability, and a changing leadership. One of the most significant factors contributing to the decline of the Roman Empire was political instability. The Roman system of imperial succession was never formalized, and as a result, there was no clear process for selecting a new emperor. This led to frequent power struggles, coups, and civil wars. The emperors are often overthrown by military generals, and a short reign had become the norm, rather than the exception. Between 255 and 284 AD, the empire had a staggering 26 emperors, many of whom ruled for only a short time before being assassinated or overthrown. This period of turmoil is often referred to as the crisis of the 3rd century. As the Roman Empire fractured internally, external threats became more pronounced. The empire's borders, which had once been protected by a vast and well-trained military, were now vulnerable. The Roman legions, which had been the pride of the empire, were stretched thin across the empire's vast borders, and the quality of the army began to deteriorate. Recruitment was increasingly reliant on non-Roman mercenaries, who were often less loyal to the empire and its ideals. These mercenaries, some of whom were from barbarian tribes, posed a unique problem for the empire as their allegiance was often divided. The Roman economy was also suffering during this time. The costs of maintaining such a vast empire were immense, and the state began to rely heavily on taxes, many of which were placed on the already overburdened peasantry. Inflation became rampant, and the empire struggled to fund the military and state infrastructure. The once prosperous trade routes were disrupted by barbarian invasions, and the empire's ability to maintain its cities and infrastructure dwindled. The political instability, compounded by economic decline and military overextension, made it clear that the empire could no longer function as it once had. However, it wasn't until the rise of Emperor Diocletian in the late 3rd century that the empire would undergo significant reforms, though these would only serve as temporary fixes rather than long-term solutions. The division of the empire. One of Diocletian's key reforms was the splitting of the empire into 2 parts, known as the East and the West. This was done in an effort to make the empire more manageable and to address the growing regional differences within the empire. The idea was that each half would be ruled by an emperor, with one senior emperor Augustus and a junior emperor Caesar in each region. This system, known as the Tetrarchy, was meant to bring stability to the empire, but it also created further divisions and rivalries among the rulers. While the division of the empire allowed for more localized governance, it also marked the beginning of the end for the unity of the Roman Empire. The Western Empire, with its capital in Rome and later Ravenna, faced increasing pressure from barbarian invasions and internal corruption, while the Eastern Empire, with its capital in Byzantium, later Constantinople, remained more prosperous and stable. The split between the East and West would continue for centuries, but it also laid the groundwork for the eventual fall of the Western Roman Empire. By the time Diocletian retired in 30 or 5 AD, the empire was still under serious threat. His successor, Constantine the Great, would go on to further solidify the division by making Christianity the official religion of the empire, but he also moved the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire to Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople. This decision would eventually give rise to the Byzantine Empire, which would survive long after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Barbarian invasions and the decline of the West. As the Western Roman Empire struggled with internal issues, it became increasingly vulnerable to external threats, particularly from the so-called barbarian tribes. These tribes, such as the Visigoth, Vandals, Huns and Ostrogoths, had long been in contact with the Roman Empire, but during the 4th and 5th centuries they began to pressure the empire's borders more heavily. The Western Roman Empire continued to weaken under the pressure of repeated barbarian invasions. In 405 AD, the Vandals sacked Rome again, further demonstrating the fragility of the empire. But it wasn't until 476 AD that the Western Roman Empire officially came to an end. In that year, the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, marking the fall of Rome and the collapse of the Western Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, however, continued to thrive under the name of the Byzantine Empire, centered around Constantinople. The legacy of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, is often viewed as one of the most significant events in world history. It marks the end of ancient Rome's dominance over the Mediterranean and the beginning of the Middle Ages in Europe. However, it is important to note that the collapse of Rome was not an immediate event. It was a long process, shaped by decades of internal decline and external pressure. The Western Roman Empire, once so mighty, fell not because of one event, but because of a series of failures: political instability, economic decline, military overextension, and the inability to deal with growing barbarian invasions. Despite the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the legacy of Rome endured. The Roman legal system, its infrastructure, and its culture continued to influence the societies that followed. The Byzantine Empire, which emerged in the east, would carry the Roman torch for another 1,000 years. Moreover, the fall of Rome set the stage for the rise of new powers in Europe, such as the Holy Roman Empire, and eventually, the nations that would shape the modern world. But if you were living in the final days of the Western Roman Empire, how would you have experienced the collapse? Would you have witnessed the sacking of Rome, the power struggles within the city, or perhaps even fled from the impending doom of the empire? What would it have been like to witness the end of what was once the greatest civilization in the known world? The aftermath, and the dawn of a new era. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 4076 AD was a profound turning point in history. The mighty civilization that had once ruled the Mediterranean world and beyond was now broken, its territories divided, and its people scattered. Yet, while the Western Empire may have collapsed, the influence of Rome did not vanish. In fact, the aftermath of its fall marked the beginning of a new chapter in European history, one that would eventually lead to the rise of medieval Europe and the formation of modern Western civilization. The aftershock of Rome's collapse. For the people living in the Western Roman Empire during its final years, the collapse was a slow and uncertain process. While the fall of Romulus Augustulus in 476 AD marked the official end of the Western Empire, the fragmentation of Roman power had been underway for centuries. The once glorious Roman cities were left in ruins, and the centralized government that had administered the empire was no longer functioning. In its place, various barbarian kingdoms and local rulers began to carve up the empire's former territory. One of the most significant changes following the fall of Rome was the disintegration of the Roman administrative structure. Without a central authority, the empire's vast bureaucracy crumbled, and the provinces that had once been tightly controlled by Rome were now governed by local leaders. In many cases, the former Roman elites were displaced by barbarian chieftains who had settled within the empire's borders. These leaders, such as Odoacer in Italy and Alaric in Spain, took control of former Roman territories, establishing new kingdoms that were heavily influenced by Roman traditions, but also distinctively barbarian in character. Yet, despite the political upheaval, many aspects of Roman culture and law endured. The cities, though in ruins, continued to be centers of life, and the Roman Catholic Church, which had risen to prominence during the later years of the empire, became a key institution in the post-Roman world. The Church's ability to maintain continuity and stability in the midst of political chaos helped preserve many of the ideas and systems that had defined Roman civilization. As a result, the Church would play a crucial role in the shaping of the medieval world. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire did not mean the complete destruction of Roman culture. Instead, it marked the beginning of a transition from Roman antiquity to the Middle Ages, a period in which the legacy of Rome would be absorbed, adapted, and transformed into something new. The rise of the Byzantine Empire. While the Western Roman Empire was in decline, the Eastern Roman Empire, commonly known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive. With its capital in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, the Byzantine Empire inherited much of the Roman legacy, including its administrative structure, military organization, and cultural traditions. For the next 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire would stand as the eastern pillar of Roman authority. One of the most notable emperors of the Byzantine Empire was Justinian I, who ruled from 50 to Justinian sought to restore the greatness of the Roman Empire by reuniting the eastern and western halves. He embarked on ambitious military campaigns to reclaim former Roman territories, including North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain. Although his efforts were only partially successful, Justinian's reign is remembered for his codification of Roman law, known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, which became the foundation of legal systems in many European countries. Justinian's rule also saw a flourishing of Byzantine culture, particularly in the arts and architecture. The most famous architectural achievement of his reign was the construction of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, a massive church that symbolized the power and wealth of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire's ability to preserve and build upon the Roman legacy allowed it to survive for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, maintaining Roman traditions in the East while adapting to new realities. The barbarian kingdoms and the formation of medieval Europe. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the territory that had once been under Roman rule was divided among various barbarian tribes. These groups, such as the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Franks, and Lombards, settled in former Roman lands and established their own kingdoms. While these barbarian kingdoms were initially unstable, over time they would evolve into the foundation of medieval Europe. One of the most important developments during this period was the rise of the Frankish kingdom under the leadership of Clovis. Clovis, who became king of the Franks in the late 5th century, united several Frankish tribes and expanded his territory, eventually becoming the first king of the Merovingian dynasty. Clovis is also notable for his conversion to Christianity, which helped solidify the Christian faith as a central component of European identity. The Christianization of the barbarian kingdoms was a significant factor in the transformation of the former Roman Empire into medieval Europe. Christianity, which had spread throughout the Roman Empire before its collapse, continued to be a unifying force in the post-Roman world. The Catholic Church became a powerful institution, not only as a religious authority but also as a political and social force. The Church played a key role in the consolidation of power in the new barbarian kingdoms, helping to legitimize rulers and guide their governance. The idea of divine right, where rulers were seen as being chosen by God, became a cornerstone of medieval European politics. With the rise of these barbarian kingdoms, the social and political landscape of Europe began to shift. Feudalism, a system in which land was exchanged for military service, emerged as the dominant structure of society. The power of kings was often decentralized, with local lords holding power over smaller regions. However, the Church remained a central institution, and the legacy of Roman law and governance would continue to influence the development of European states. The enduring legacy of Rome. While the Western Roman Empire may have fallen, its influence continued to shape Europe for centuries to come. The fall of Rome did not mark the end of the Roman world. It marked a transition to a new era. The infrastructure, legal systems and cultural practices that had defined the Roman Empire were absorbed into the new kingdoms and empires that emerged in its wake. Roman law, in particular, had a lasting impact. The Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled by Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, became the foundation of legal systems in much of Europe. The concept of citizenship, rights and duties, which had been central to Roman society, continued to influence European legal tradition. The idea of a centralized state and a powerful bureaucracy also found its way into the governance of medieval kingdoms. Moreover, the Roman cultural legacy was preserved through the works of Roman authors, philosophers, and historians. The texts of ancient Rome were studied and admired during the Middle Ages, and many aspects of Roman art, architecture, and engineering were incorporated into medieval designs. The very idea of Roman greatness, its military power, its architecture, its literature, remained a model for later civilizations, influencing the Renaissance and the development of modern Western culture. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire while a tragic and disruptive event ultimately paved the way for the transformation of Europe. Without the fall of Rome, the rise of Christianity, the emergence of feudalism, and the consolidation of European kingdoms might never have occurred. The medieval world, though vastly different from the Roman world, was built on the foundations laid by Rome. Reflection. What would it have been like to live through Rome's fall? Imagine yourself living in Rome during its final year. The once thriving city of marble and grandeur is now crumbling. The streets, once bustling with traders, soldiers and citizens, are now abandoned. The emperor's orders seem meaningless, and the political power that once ruled the world now seems fragile. Would you have fled the city, seeking refuge in the countryside, or would you have stayed to witness the collapse of the empire you had once called home? The final days of Rome were filled with uncertainty, fear, and the loss of a way of life. But for those who lived through it, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire was not the end of civilization. It was the beginning of a new era. The Salem witch trials. Hysteria and justice in colonial America. The seeds of fear in the small, Puritan village of Salem, Massachusetts. In the late 17th century, a series of events would ignite one of the most infamous witch hunts in American history. The Salem witch trials, which took place in 1692, have become a symbol of mass hysteria, injustice, and the consequences of superstition running rampant. But how did this small, isolated community, based on strict religious beliefs, come to accuse more than 200 people of witchcraft and execute? What was it that caused the people of Salem to turn against each other in a frenzy of fear and accusations? To understand the Salem witch trials, we must first examine the context in which they occurred. Colonial New England in the 17th century was a place of intense religious devotion, where Puritans sought to build a city upon a hill based on strict moral codes and religious principles. Puritan life was characterized by a deep belief in the supernatural, the presence of Satan, and the constant struggle between good and evil. Witches, in Puritan belief, were seen as agents of Satan, capable of causing harm to others through dark, malevolent power. Anyone suspected of witchcraft was seen as a threat to the community and a sign of moral decay. However, Salem was also a community undergoing immense pressure. The town had faced economic hardship, political instability, and internal division. Tensions were high in Salem, and a series of personal and political conflicts simmered beneath the surface. The arrival of the witch trials can be traced back to a combination of social, religious, and psychological factors that created an environment ripe for panic. It began in the winter of 1691-1692, when a group of young girls in Salem Village, some of whom were the daughters and nieces of local ministers, began to exhibit strange behaviors. These girls, led by Betty Parris, the daughter of the village minister Samuel Parris, began to have violent fits, screaming, contorting their bodies, and claiming to see visions of strange figures. The local physician, Dr. William Griggs, could not find any medical explanation for the girls' symptoms, and their behavior was quickly attributed to witchcraft. In a society where anything unexplained was often seen as supernatural, the connection between illness and witchcraft was an easy leap. The girls' strange behavior soon spread to other girls in the village, and the fear of witchcraft began to take hold. The Puritan belief in the supernatural, particularly the idea that witches were in league with the devil, helped fuel the fear that something sinister was at work. But what began as a few isolated cases quickly escalated into widespread hysteria, as more and more people were accused of being witches. The accusations were often fueled by personal grudges, social conflicts, and deep-seated fears of outsiders. In a community where social bonds were tightly woven, accusations of witchcraft could tear apart friendships and families. As the number of accusations grew, a system of trials and investigations was put in place. The town's ministers and other influential figures began to take the accusations seriously, and the court system became embroiled in the crisis. The accused were often subjected to brutal interrogation techniques, including the infamous touch test and spectral evidence. In these trials, witnesses could testify to seeing the spectre or ghostly image of the accused person causing harm, even if there was no physical evidence. This allowed for almost anyone to be accused, regardless of their innocence. The atmosphere in Salem became one of fear, suspicion, and accusation, where even the most well-respected members of society were at risk of being named. But how did this seemingly small outbreak of hysteria spiral out of control so quick? What was it about the Puritan belief system, the pressures of the time, and the culture of fear that allowed such a large-scale tragedy to unfold? And what drove the people of Salem to accuse, convict, and execute those they once called neighbors? The trials begin. By the spring of 1692, the witchcraft accusations in Salem had escalated beyond the control of local ministers and town leaders. What had begun as a few isolated cases of strange behavior among young girls quickly grew into a full-blown crisis. Salem was now a community in turmoil, one gripped by fear, suspicion, and a growing sense of paranoia. The trials had begun, and with them, the power of accusation became a weapon in the hands of those who would use it to settle personal scores, gain power, or protect themselves. The first formal trial was held in March 1692, when Bridget Bishop, a local woman known for her eccentric behavior and somewhat unconventional lifestyle, was accused of witchcraft. Bishop was arrested after several young girls claimed to see her spectre causing harm to them. The evidence against her was flimsy. She was known to have been outspoken, and her accusers were often motivated by personal grievances. But the court was already predisposed to believe in the existence of witches, and in the climate of fear, it didn't take much for the charges to stick. Bishop's trial set the tone for what would become a horrific series of events. The court relied heavily on spectral evidence, a form of testimony in which accusers claimed to see the spirits or spectres of the accused performing evil deeds, even when the accused were not physically present. This kind of evidence, while not based on any tangible facts, was deemed credible, especially in the religiously charged atmosphere of Salem. Those accused were often unable to defend themselves against such intangible claims. As the trials continued, the number of accused grew exponentially. At the height of the witch hunts, accusations were flying in every direction. Some of the accusers were prominent members of the community, while others were marginalized individuals who had been excluded from Salem's social and religious circles. Women, particularly those who were poor, widowed, or socially isolated, were disproportionately targeted. But men were not immune from accusations either. Some of the most prominent figures in Salem, including a few well-respected men, were named in the trials. One of the most famous cases was that of Reverend George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village, who was accused of using witchcraft to control the girls who had become the primary accusers. Burroughs had fallen out of favor with the village leaders after a dispute over his salary, and now he was accused of being the mastermind behind the witchcraft epidemic. The case against him relied heavily on his supposed ability to recite the Lord's Prayer flawlessly, a claim that was presented as evidence of his guilt, since witches were believed to be unable to recite Christian prayers. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, Burroughs was convicted and executed by hanging in August 1692. As the trials continued, the atmosphere of fear and mistrust spread throughout Salem and beyond. The accusations were often based on little more than personal animosities, rumors, and superstitions. It became almost impossible for anyone to defend themselves. Those accused of witchcraft were often given the grim choice of confessing and naming others in order to save their lives, or refusing to confess and facing execution. It was a cruel and arbitrary system that led to numerous false confessions and the deaths of innocent people. In many ways, the Salem witch trials became a spectacle, an emotional, irrational frenzy where people's lives were decided by little more than hearsay. The court system that was supposed to ensure justice had become part of the problem, and the judges and officials who oversaw the trials were unable or unwilling to challenge the growing tide of accusations. The role of religion in particular was a powerful force in the trial. The Puritan belief in the devil's influence on the world and the threat of witchcraft was so deeply ingrained in the culture that it allowed for the validation of accusations without any real evidence. This religious fervor, combined with the fear of the unknown, created the perfect storm for mass hysteria. The accusations were not only religious in nature, they were also deeply political. At a time when the community was divided over land disputes, power struggles, and growing tensions between Salem Village and the neighboring Salem town, the witch trials became a tool for political maneuvering. Those with grievances against their neighbors saw the trials as an opportunity to eliminate rivals or to settle old scores. It was a climate in which personal vendettas could easily be cloaked under the guise of righteous religious fervor. As the number of executions mounted, the people of Salem began to question the legitimacy of the trials. One of the first to speak out was Judge Samuel Sewall, who had been involved in the trials from the beginning. In 1697, Sewall publicly apologized for his role in the trials, admitting that the use of spectral evidence had been deeply flawed. His confession came too late to save those who had already been executed, but it marked the beginning of a shift in public opinion. The end of the trials came about in 1693, when the governor of Massachusetts, William Phips, intervened. After his wife was accused of witchcraft, Phips, who had initially supported the trials, became disillusioned with the proceedings. He halted the trials, declaring that no further convictions would be allowed, and he ordered the release of many of the accused. The court was disbanded, and by the end of 1693, the witch hunts in Salem came to an official end. Despite the cessation of the trials, the legacy of the Salem witch trials would linger for centuries. The fear, suspicion, and injustice of those months left deep scars on Salem and New England as a whole. The trials highlighted the dangers of mass hysteria, the perils of superstition, and the dark consequences of allowing fear to outweigh reason. Would you have been able to navigate the paranoia of Salem? How would you have defended yourself against accusations that were grounded in nothing but fear and rumor? Could you survive in a world where guilt was often determined by little more than whispers and vague testimonies? Reflection and legacy. The end of the Salem witch trials in 1693 didn't immediately erase the damage done. The aftermath of the trials was felt not just in Salem but throughout New England, leaving a legacy of fear, regret, and lasting cultural impact. While the trials were officially over, the scars they left on the community and the collective consciousness of the time were deep and long-lasting. The psychological and social impact. The emotional and psychological toll on the people of Salem, particularly on the accused and their families, was profound. Those who were falsely accused often faced years of social stigma and isolation. Even those who had not been executed, but had confessed to witchcraft under duress or coercion, were never truly free of the shadow of suspicion. The community had been divided into accusers and the accused, with trust shattered and relationships broken. People who had once been close friends and neighbors were now forever marked by their roles in the witch trials. The trials created a deep sense of distrust in the community. While some people attempted to return to their normal lives, the sense of paranoia lingered. The fact that so many lives had been destroyed based on flimsy accusations, rumors, and superstitions left a scar that wouldn't heal easily. Families were torn apart as the emotional and physical toll on the surviving accused weighed heavily. Those who had lost loved ones to the trials, whether through execution or imprisonment, were left to grapple with grief and loss, knowing that justice had not been served. The fear that had gripped Salem did not vanish immediately after the trials ended. In fact, the memory of those terrifying months remained embedded in the psyche of the people for years to come. This atmosphere of suspicion and fear led to a deep mistrust of the judicial system in the years following the trial. Many began to question the role of the church, the legal system, and the broader societal structure that allowed such hysteria to unfold. Public apologies and efforts at reparations. In the years following the trials, a sense of collective guilt began to emerge. The involvement of so many community leaders and respected figures in the trials caused many to reconsider the role of authority figures in the persecution of innocent people. By the late 17th century, the first attempts at public accountability began to surface. In 1697, one of the key figures involved in the trials, Judge Samuel Sewall, publicly apologized for his role in the events. This was an unprecedented step in a time when accountability for judicial decisions was rare. Sewall's public repentance was significant, especially as he admitted that the evidence used in the trials was flawed and that the executions were unjust. This moment of public contrition was not enough to undo the damage done, but it began the slow process of healing for the community. Over the following decades, the state of Massachusetts took additional steps toward reparations. In 1702, the Massachusetts General Court declared the trials unlawful, declaring that the accused should not have been tried under the circumstances that prevailed. It wasn't until 1711, however, that the Massachusetts government formally reversed the convictions of the accused, providing monetary compensation to the families of the victims. But this apology, coming many years after the damage was done, could not undo the suffering of those who had lost their lives or their reputations. Cultural reflection and the long-term legacy. The Salem witch trials have continued to be a subject of fascination and reflection for historians and the public alike. Over time, the events have come to symbolize not just the dangers of superstition and hysteria, but also the importance of due process, justice, and the need for skepticism in the face of fear-driven accusations. In modern times, the trials have been used as a cautionary tale. The phrase witch hunt has become shorthand for any form of baseless persecution or scapegoating, particularly when it involves the targeting of marginalized or vulnerable fervor with legal authority. The belief in witchcraft and the devil was so ingrained in Puritan society that it allowed for extreme measures to be taken without any real evidence. The trials stand as a stark reminder of how religious and political authorities can manipulate public fear for control, with devastating consequences. Lessons learned. The enduring relevance of the Salem witch trials. Despite the tragedy that unfolded in Salem, the witch trials ultimately led to some important changes in the way justice was administered. The use of spectral evidence, once a key component of the trials, was eventually outlawed, and the importance of tangible evidence in legal proceedings became more pronounced. In the years following the trials, people began to demand more transparency, fairness, and evidence in legal proceedings, which laid the groundwork for the more modern legal systems that would emerge. While the events of the Salem witch trials have become a tragic part of American history, they also provide crucial lessons that continue to resonate today. They serve as a reminder of the dangers of mass hysteria and the need for critical thinking in times of fear. They also highlight the importance of protecting individual rights and ensuring that justice is not clouded by superstition or unfounded accusations. Living through such a time of terror would have been unimaginable for those who found themselves accused. But the legacy of Salem serves as a testament to human resilience. The survivors, whether they were the falsely accused or those who lived to witness the trial's end, became part of a larger narrative that speaks to the capacity for recovery and reflection in the face of fear and injustice. If you were alive in Salem during those months of terror, would you have been able to remain calm and resist the overwhelming fear? Or would the pressure to conform to the hysteria and the social pressures of your community have led you to accuse others in a desperate attempt to save yourself? The lessons from Salem remind us that justice must always be tempered with reason, and the fear of the unknown should never guide decisions that affect the lives of others. The fall of the Berlin Wall, dividing a city, uniting a nation. A city divided. In the aftermath of World War II, Europe was left in ruins, its political and social structures upended. One of the most striking symbols of the Cold War was the division of Berlin, the capital of Germany. What had once been a unified city at the heart of one of the world's most powerful nations was now split in two, a microcosm of the ideological conflict between the Soviet-backed East and the capitalist West. The Berlin Wall, which would come to symbolize the division of not only a city but an entire continent, was erected in 1961, sealing off East Berlin from West Berlin. Berlin's division was not merely a physical barrier, but a representation of the wider geopolitical struggle that shaped much of the second half of the 20th century. The wall was built as a response to the massive exodus of East Germans fleeing to the west through Berlin. As the Soviet-controlled East German government faced mounting pressure from its citizens, who sought the freedoms and prosperity offered by the West, the East German government, backed by the Soviet Union, decided to fortify its borders. The result was the Berlin Wall, a concrete barrier running for over 96 miles, complete with guard towers, barbed wire, and heavily armed border patrols. For 28 years, the Berlin Wall stood as a symbol of repression, separating families, friends, and community. On one side, West Berlin became a vibrant, thriving city, bolstered by the support of the United States and Western Europe. On the other side, East Berlin remained under the heavy hand of Soviet influence, its people living in an isolated society marked by surveillance, propaganda, and the ever-present threat of arrest for any perceived opposition to the regime. But how did Berlin go from being one of the most dynamic cities in Europe to a symbol of division and fear? What factors led to the construction of the wall, and how did its presence affect the daily lives of the people living in its shadow? As we reflect on the history of Berlin before the wall came down, we see a city caught in the crossfire of the Cold War, where politics and ideology defined the lives of its inhabitants. Following the end of World War II in 1945, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, each controlled by one of the Allied powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain and France. Berlin, located deep within the Soviet-controlled Eastern Zone, was similarly divided into 4 sectors, while the Western Allies, the US and Britain and France, developed West Berlin into a capitalist enclave. The Soviet-controlled eastern part became the capital of the German Democratic Republic (GDR), which was under communist rule. Tensions between the two sides escalated quickly, especially as East Germans began fleeing to the west in large numbers, seeking freedom and better living conditions. The mass emigration from East to West Berlin, particularly in the years after the construction of the wall, was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the East German regime. In the early 1960s, East Berliners were leaving in droves, seeking asylum in the West, and this exodus was deeply embarrassing for the Soviet-backed government. The building of the Berlin Wall was intended to prevent the flight of its citizens, but it also served as a powerful visual reminder of the divisions that had already taken root in Europe following World War II. The wall not only divided Berlin but also symbolized the split between 2 ideologically opposed worlds, one capitalist and free, the other communist and controlled by the Soviet Union. As the wall was constructed, it was not just an obstruction of concrete and barbed wire, it was an emotional and psychological divide. The lives of people in Berlin were forever altered. Imagine waking up one day to find your city split in 2, knowing that the people you once saw regularly, family members, friends, co-workers, could no longer visit or communicate freely. The wall became a prison for the people of East Berlin, while West Berliners, though living in a freer environment, were constantly reminded of the division that separated them from their neighbors. Would you have been able to accept the partitioning of your city? Or would the divide between East and West have been a constant source of tension in your life? Would you have faced the fear of leaving your home to cross into the West, knowing the potential risks and danger? These questions, in one way or another, haunted the citizens of Berlin for nearly 3 decades. Life in the shadow of the wall. The construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 transformed the daily life of Berliners in profound and often painful ways. For the people of East Berlin, the wall represented not only a physical barrier, but also an emotional and psychological one. Families, friends and colleagues who had once shared a common life were suddenly separated by concrete, barbed wire, and armed guards. The wall effectively turned East Berlin into a giant prison, one where freedom of movements, speech, and thought were severely restricted. For the people of West Berlin, the wall served as a constant reminder of the divisions that defined their lives. Though West Berlin remained a thriving, democratic city, it was an island of freedom surrounded by communist East Germany. West Berliners were free to travel, communicate, and live without the restrictions imposed on their East German counterparts. Yet, they were also deeply aware that their neighbors just across the wall lived under vastly different conditions, trapped in a society that was controlled by the oppressive Soviet-backed East German regime. East Berlin, life behind the wall. Life in East Berlin was defined by surveillance, repression, and a constant sense of fear. The East German government, led by the Socialist Unity Party, ruled with an iron fist, using the secret police, known as the Stasi, to monitor citizens and root out any opposition. The Stasi had a vast network of informants, and many East Germans lived with the knowledge that their every move could be watched. The constant threat of punishment for speaking out against the government or trying to escape to the West kept people in a state of anxiety and distrust. One of the most visible consequences of the wall was the separation of families. In many cases, people who lived in East Berlin were unable to visit or communicate with relatives living in West Berlin. For those whose families were divided by the wall, the pain of separation was acute. The wall was not just a barrier that kept people physically apart, it was a symbol of the growing divide between 2 very different worlds. People were forced to say goodbye to loved ones, knowing they might never see them again. The separation extended beyond families. It also fractured friendships and communities. Those living in East Berlin were forced to live in an environment of fear, isolation and paranoia. For the average citizen in East Berlin, the wall was a daily reminder of the limitations placed on their freedom. The regime controlled nearly every aspect of life, from employment to education, and the government's influence reached into people's private lives. Citizens were required to toe the line, conforming to the rigid expectations of the state. Dissent was not tolerated, and any attempts to resist the regime, whether through protests or by attempting to escape to the west, were met with harsh punishment. Escape attempts, whether by swimming across the Berlin River or scaling the wall, were often deadly. Many would-be defectors were shot while trying to flee the east, and the threat of death or imprisonment loomed large over the population. One of the most remarkable aspects of life in East Berlin was the underground resistance movement. Despite the oppressive environment, many East Germans sought ways to challenge the regime, either covertly or through small acts of defiance. Some were involved in efforts to help people escape across the wall, while others found ways to communicate with the outside world, spreading news of the oppression and the realities of life in East Berlin. These brave individuals, though operating under constant threat of discovery, played an important role in keeping the spirit of resistance alive. West Berlin, the island of freedom. For West Berliners, life on the other side of the wall was in many ways more secure and more prosperous. West Berlin, although isolated from the rest of West Germany, was a thriving, free city, with a market-driven economy, a democratic government, and freedom of speech. West Berlin was seen as a beacon of hope and opportunity for those living in East Germany. Yet, despite the freedom, West Berliners could not escape the stark reality of the division. The wall, with its watchtowers and barbed wire, served as a constant reminder that their city was not fully whole. West Berliners had to navigate a complex and often awkward relationship with their counterparts in East Berlin. Visits to East Berlin were heavily restricted, and even communication between the two sides was fraught with obstacles. Though West Berliners could live relatively normal lives, the wall created a sense of sadness and uncertainty, as the divide between East and West grew ever more entrenched. The wall also cast a long shadow over the broader West German population. Though the Western Allies, primarily the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, provided substantial support to West Berlin, the city's isolation remained a painful symbol of the broader Cold War conflict. West Berliners were acutely aware that they lived in a city that was surrounded by an enemy state, and many feared that the wall could one day become a permanent fixture in the landscape of Europe. The wall represented not just a physical divide, but also a stark ideological and political divide between the East and the West. It was a reminder that Europe was divided, not just by geography, but by political ideologies that seemed impossible to bridge. West Berlin's status as a symbol of freedom in the heart of the Soviet-controlled East drew attention from around the world. It became a focal point for Cold War tensions, with both the United States and the Soviet Union using the city as a political tool in their struggle for global dominance. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy famously visited West Berlin and delivered his iconic Ich bin ein Berliner speech, expressing solidarity with the people of West Berlin and reaffirming the United States' commitment to defending the city. This speech became one of the defining moments of the Cold War, symbolizing the West's resolve to protect the ideals of freedom and democracy in the face of Soviet oppression. But as the years passed, West Berliners, like their counterparts in the East, began to grow weary of the situation. They lived in a city surrounded by a massive concrete barrier, knowing that their fellow Germans were living on the other side in a repressive, authoritarian regime. While West Berlin was relatively free, the sense of division and isolation persisted. The people of West Berlin longed for reunification, even as they enjoyed the benefits of democracy and capitalism. A future uncertain, the wall's psychological toll. The Berlin Wall's psychological toll on both East and West Berliners was profound. For East Germans, the wall represented not just physical separation, but a constant reminder of the limitations on their freedom. It was a tangible symbol of the repressive state they lived under, where the possibility of escape or any sense of hope for a better future seemed impossible. The fear of being caught, imprisoned, or killed for attempting to cross the wall weighed heavily on the minds of many. For West Berliners, the wall was both a source of pride and a source of guilt. While they were free, they knew that their fellow Germans were living in a divided, oppressive world. This division created a sense of alienation, as families were separated and friends lost touch. The wall created a deep emotional divide that was not easily surmountable. What would it have been like to live in Berlin during these decades of division? To be separated from your loved ones by a concrete barrier that seemed to stretch endlessly, dividing not just your city but your very identity. Could you have lived with the knowledge that the world was watching, but nothing was changing? The Berlin Wall, though a structure of stone and metal, became a symbol of the emotional and psychological divide between two radically different ideologies and ways of life. The fall of the wall and the end of an era. As the 1980s came to a close, the political climate in Eastern Europe began to shift. The Soviet Union, once the driving force behind the Iron Curtain, was in decline. Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, introduced reforms that would forever change the course of history. Under Gorbachev, policies like glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring sought to open up Soviet society and reform the faltering economy. These reforms would not only affect the Soviet Union itself, but would have profound implications for the entire Eastern Bloc, including East Germany. For years, the Berlin Wall stood as an impenetrable barrier, separating families, friends, and a divided nation. But by the late 1980s, the winds of change were beginning to blow, and the wall's days were numbered. The winds of change, Gorbachev's reforms, and the collapse of communism. In the late 1980s, Gorbachev's reforms had already begun to stir unrest in Eastern Europe. Citizens of Eastern Bloc countries were growing increasingly dissatisfied with the rigid, oppressive regimes they lived under. In East Germany, the economic system was crumbling, and disillusionment with the government was at an all-time high. As people in East Germany witnessed the wave of democratic reforms sweeping across neighboring Eastern European countries, they too began to demand change. The pressure to reform in East Germany grew as thousands of people took to the streets in peaceful protests. Beginning in 1989, demonstrations against the government erupted in cities across the country, including Leipzig, East Berlin, and Dresden. The protests were driven by a combination of factors: economic hardship, a desire for political freedom, and the influence of the changes happening across Eastern Europe. These protests were fueled by a growing sense that the rigid, oppressive regime of East Germany was no longer sustainable. As the protests intensified, the East German government found itself in a difficult position. The country's leader, Erich Honecker, initially refused to entertain any notion of reform, but the government was increasingly unable to quell the rising tide of dissent. Meanwhile, Gorbachev's refusal to send Soviet troops to suppress uprisings in Eastern Europe further weakened the East German government's resolve. In a shocking moment, Gorbachev famously declared that the Soviet Union would not interfere in the internal affairs of the Eastern Bloc, signaling to East German leaders that the status quo could not be maintained. This period of political uncertainty, combined with the sheer volume of public protests, led to cracks in the East German regime. The Berlin Wall, which had been a symbol of Soviet strength and division for nearly 3 decades, now seemed like an anachronism, a reminder of an era that was quickly becoming obsolete. The moment of uncertainty, the announcement that changed everything. On November 9, 1989, the East German government made a fateful announcement. In an attempt to quell the unrest and under pressure from the protests, the government stated that it would allow East Germans to travel to the West without restrictions. The decision was a result of political pressure, but it was not well thought out. In a poorly timed and unclear statement, a government spokesperson, Ginter Schabowski, inadvertently announced that East Berliners could cross the wall immediately. This announcement, although not an official declaration of the wall's fall, was the spark that ignited the final push for reunification. At the time, no one quite understood the implications of Schabowski's words. The announcement was vague, and the border guards were unprepared for the flood of people who would soon demand to cross. As news spread of the supposed opening of the wall, thousands of East Berliners poured into the checkpoints, eager to reunite with family and friends in the West. The confusion and excitement were palpable, and within hours the Berlin Wall began to crumble, literally and figuratively. The border guards, caught off guard by the crowds and unable to receive clear instructions from their superiors, opened the gates. The wall, which had stood for 28 years as the dividing line between East and West, was breached. People began to climb over the wall, tear it down with their hands, and celebrate as they reunited with loved ones in West Berlin. The jubilant scenes were broadcast around the world, marking the symbolic end of the Cold War and the beginning of the reunification of Germany. The emotional and physical destruction of the wall, the fall of the Berlin Wall, was not just a political event, it was an emotional one. For the people of East and West Berlin, the wall had represented more than just a physical barrier. It had been a constant reminder of division, repression, and the pain of separation. The jubilant celebrations that followed the wall's fall were a testament to the deep longing for reunification, for freedom, and for the healing wounds that had existed for nearly 3 decades. In the hours and days that followed the wall's collapse, Berliners from both sides gathered at the wall, celebrating, dancing, and singing. The city that had been divided for so long was now united, and the emotional weight of that moment was overwhelming. The wall, which had symbolized so much pain and suffering, was now being torn apart. People used hammers, chisels, and even their hands to break pieces off, which were later sold as souvenirs. The physical destruction of the wall was a symbol of the deep yearning for freedom and unity that had been suppressed for so long. The end of the wall also marked the beginning of the reunification of Germany. In the months following the fall, the process of merging the two parts of the country began, with political, economic, and social integration taking years to fully accomplish. The reunification was a complex process, filled with challenges as East Germany's economy struggled to integrate with the more prosperous West. Yet, despite the hurdles, the eventual reunification of Germany in 1990 was seen as a triumph for democracy, freedom, and the will of the people. The global impact of the wall's fall. The fall of the Berlin Wall had far-reaching effects beyond Germany. It marked the end of the Cold War, the ideological and geopolitical struggle that had defined much of the 20th century. The wall's collapse was a direct challenge to the Soviet Union's hold on Eastern Europe, and in the years that followed, the communist regimes in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia would also fall. The Iron Curtain that had divided Europe for decades began to dissolve, and Europe began its journey toward reunification. On a global scale, the fall of the Berlin Wall symbolized the triumph of freedom over tyranny, the victory of democratic ideals over authoritarianism. It represented a new era of hope and possibility, where the divisions of the past were being overcome, and the future seemed open to new opportunities. Reflection. Living through history. Imagine living through the decades when the Berlin Wall stood as an impenetrable barrier. Would you have been able to endure the psychological toll of knowing that the people you loved could be so close, yet so far away? How would you have felt, knowing that you were trapped in a system where escape was nearly impossible, and the world beyond your city seemed like a distant dream? The fall of the Berlin Wall was not just a political event, it was a deeply personal experience for millions of people, and the joy of reunification was felt as a collective sigh of relief and a long-awaited reunion of divided families and communities. In the years that followed the wall's fall, the world changed in ways that seemed unimaginable just a short time before. The geopolitical landscape of Europe was redefined, and the hope for a future of unity and peace is rekindled. The Berlin Wall, once an enduring symbol of division, would forever be remembered as the barrier that came down, heralding the beginning of a new chapter in world history. The rise and fall of the Aztec Empire, a civilization of wonder and tragedy, a city built on a lake. The Aztec Empire, at its height, was one of the most sophisticated and powerful civilizations in the Americas. The heart of this empire was the great city of Tenochtitlan, built on the shores of Lake Texcoco in what is now central Mexico. The city's location, though seemingly an obstacle, was actually a testament to the engineering genius of the Aztecs. They constructed the city on a series of islands in the lake, using causeways and canals to connect the different parts of the city. Floating gardens, known as chinampas, allowed them to grow crops in the shallow waters of the lake, providing a sustainable food source for the growing population. Tenochtitlan was a marvel of urban planning. At its peak, it was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population of over 200. The city was laid out in a grid pattern, with streets, temples, marketplaces, and plazas arranged in a way that reflected the Aztecs' understanding of cosmology and their connection to the gods. The centerpiece of the city was the Templo Mayor, a massive pyramid dedicated to the gods Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. This temple was not only a place of worship, but also a symbol of the Aztecs' power and their central place in the world. The Aztecs, or Mexica as they called themselves, had a deep connection to their religion, which was intertwined with every aspect of their society. They believed that the gods had created the world, and that it was their duty to sustain it through rituals, sacrifices, and offerings. The most dramatic of these rituals was human sacrifice, which was carried out on a massive scale. The Aztecs believed that blood offerings were necessary to keep the sun moving across the sky and to ensure the fertility of the land. These sacrifices, though shocking to modern sensibilities, were an integral part of Aztec religion and society. But the Aztec Empire did not rise to prominence overnight. It was a civilization forged through conquest, diplomacy, and political maneuvering. The Mexican agricultural and engineering techniques allowed them to dominate the region. The Aztec Empire was made up of a network of city-states that were ruled by local lords, or Tlatoani, who were expected to pay tribute to the Aztec Emperor, or Huey Tlatoani. In exchange, the Aztec Emperor would provide military protection and maintain political alliances. However, this empire was not without its challenges. The Aztecs' dependence on tribute and human sacrifice created tensions with their subjects. Many of the people they ruled over were not happy with the demands placed upon them, and rebellions were common. Yet, the Aztecs were able to maintain control through a combination of military strength, political alliances, and religious fervor. But for all of the Aztecs' achievements, their empire would not last forever. In the early 16th century, a force greater than any internal rebellion would bring about the fall of Tenochtitlan, the arrival of the Spanish. What drove the Aztecs to build such a vast empire, and what were the foundations of their success? How did they reconcile their religious practices with the demands of empire, and how did their political system help them maintain control over such a vast territory? More importantly, what led to the empire's sudden and dramatic downfall? The coming of the Spanish. The Aztec Empire, at its peak, was a powerful and sophisticated civilization, but it was also a world on the brink of change. In 1519, that change would come from a direction no one could have foreseen: the arrival of Spanish conquistadors, led by Hernán Cortés. For centuries, the Aztecs had ruled a vast empire that stretched across much of modern-day Mexico. They had conquered neighboring city-states, absorbed their cultures, and built an empire that was unmatched in terms of its complexity and organization. But the arrival of the Spanish would mark the beginning of the empire's end. Spanish encounter the Aztecs. In November 1519, Hernán Cortés, a former soldier in Cuba, arrived on the coast of what is now Mexico with a small army of Spanish conquistadors, along with a contingent of indigenous allies who were discontented with Aztec rule. The Spanish had heard rumors of a rich and powerful empire to the west, and they sought to claim it for Spain. What they found in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, however, was a city unlike anything they had ever seen. Tenochtitlan was a marvel of engineering and urban planning, with wide streets, canals, and impressive public buildings. The city's population, numbering over 200,000, was more than any European city at the time. The Spanish were awestruck by the grandeur of the Aztec capital, but this awe was quickly replaced by a sense of greed and ambition. Cortés, driven by the lust for gold and power, set his sights on the heart of the empire, and his arrival marked the beginning of a dramatic and fateful clash between two worlds. The first encounter between the Aztecs and the Spanish was marked by a complex mix of diplomacy and suspicion. Emperor Montezuma II, who ruled the Aztecs at the time, was initially intrigued by the arrival of the Spaniards. He had heard rumors of pale-skinned people from across the ocean, and some of his priests believed that Cortés and his men might be representatives of the god. Montezuma, unsure of their intentions but eager to avoid conflict, welcomed them with gifts of gold and hospitality. He even allowed them to enter Tenochtitlan, where they were housed in the emperor's palace. But Cortés was no mere diplomat. He quickly recognized the wealth and power of the Aztec Empire, and began to devise a strategy to overthrow it. Cortés took advantage of Montezuma's initial trust, but tensions soon began to escalate. The Spanish were not content with gold alone. They also sought control over the people and lands of the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs, for their part, began to grow wary of the Spanish presence in their city, as their suspicions grew about the true intentions of these strange visitors. The siege of Tenochtitlan, what began as a diplomatic exchange, quickly turned into a full-scale confrontation. Cortés, eager to consolidate his power, turned to the indigenous peoples who were subject to Aztec rule many of these people, such as the Tlaxcalans, had suffered under the Aztec practice of human sacrifice and were eager to ally themselves with the Spanish in the hopes of overthrowing their Aztec overlords. With his new allies, Cortés launched a series of attacks against Aztec forces. Despite their initial military superiority, the Aztecs found themselves at a disadvantage against the Spanish and their advanced weaponry, including firearms, steel swords, and horses. The introduction of diseases like smallpox, which the Spanish brought with them, also took a devastating toll on the indigenous population, who had no immunity to these new illnesses. It is estimated that up to 90% of the indigenous population in the Americas would eventually succumb to diseases brought by Europeans. The Spanish, bolstered by their indigenous allies, laid siege to Tenochtitlan. For months the Aztec forces fought desperately to defend their city, but they were ultimately overwhelmed by the superior firepower and tactics of the Spanish. The once mighty Aztec capital fell after a brutal and bloody siege, and the people of Tenochtitlan were left to face the consequences of their defeat. The Spanish soldiers, fueled by greed and the promise of riches, sacked the city, looted its treasures, and destroyed much of its infrastructure. Montezuma, the emperor who had once welcomed the Spanish with open arms, was killed during the siege, though the exact circumstances of his death remain unclear. Some accounts suggest that he was killed by his own people, who had grown disillusioned with his attempts to appease the Spanish, while others claim that he was executed by Cortés. Either way, his death marked the end of the Aztec leadership, and the empire's fate was sealed. The fall of an empire. The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 marked the end of the Aztec Empire. Cortés and his men, along with their indigenous allies, had brought down one of the most powerful civilizations in the Americas, and the Spanish would go on to establish a vast colonial empire in the New World. The riches that Cortés looted from the Aztecs, including gold and silver, helped fuel Spain's wealth and power in the centuries that followed. But the conquest of the Aztecs was not without its consequences. The destruction of Tenochtitlan was not just the fall of a city, it was the collapse of an entire way of life. The Aztec people, their religion, and their culture were destroyed in the wake of the Spanish conquest. The city of Tenochtitlan, once a shining example of Aztec civilization, was dismantled and replaced with a Spanish colonial city, Mexico City. The Spanish imposed their language, religion, and culture on the indigenous peoples, and many of the customs, traditions, and knowledge of the Aztecs were lost or suppressed. The fall of the Aztec Empire is a tragic story of conquest, loss, and cultural upheaval. It is also a reminder of the destructive power of imperialism and the enduring impact of European colonization on the indigenous peoples of the Americas. But while the Aztec Empire was destroyed, its legacy endured. The achievements of the Aztecs, from their engineering feats to their rich artistic and cultural traditions, continue to be studied and admired. The ruins of Tenochtitlan stand as a reminder of a civilization that once thrived in the heart of the Americas and was ultimately undone by the arrival of a foreign power. As we reflect on the rise and fall of the Aztec Empire, we are left to consider what could the Aztecs have achieved if they had been able to defend their empire against the Spanish? Would their civilization have continued to grow and evolve, or was their fate sealed the moment the Spanish arrived on their shores? The legacy of the Aztecs. The fall of the Aztec Empire in 1521 was the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Mexico, but it also marked the destruction of one of the most complex and advanced civilizations of the pre-Columbian Americas. The conquest of the Aztecs by Hernán Cortés and his small army of Spanish conquistadors, aided by indigenous allies, led to the dissolution of an empire that had built towering pyramids, advanced agricultural systems, and a vibrant culture. Yet, despite their downfall, the legacy of the Aztecs endures to this day. The cultural legacy. While much of the physical infrastructure of Tenochtitlan was destroyed in the aftermath of the Spanish conquest, the cultural contributions of the Aztecs survived in various ways. Their knowledge of astronomy, medicine, engineering, and art laid the foundation for much of what would follow in the region. The Aztecs were master builders, engineers, and artists. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was an architectural wonder, with grand temples, causeways, and intricate canals. The city was a testament to their engineering skills, with the chinampa system, a form of floating agriculture, allowing them to produce food in the shallow waters of Lake Texcoco. The Aztecs also made significant advances in the fields of astronomy and mathematics. Their calendar system, based on a sophisticated understanding of the sun, moon, and stars, was one of the most accurate in the ancient world. The tonal Pohuali, the Aztec sacred calendar, consisted of 260 days, and their calendar system influenced the way time was measured for centuries. The Aztecs had a profound connection to the cosmos, and their ceremonies, rituals, and everyday lives were deeply intertwined with the movements of the stars and planets. Aztec art, too, has had a lasting impact. The vibrant murals, sculptures, and codices they created continue to captivate modern scholars and art enthusiasts. Their use of symbolism in art was intricate, with gods, animals, and geometric patterns representing both religious beliefs and societal values. The Aztecs also had a rich tradition of poetry and storytelling, much of which has been passed down through the centuries. The Florentine Codex, a 16th century manuscript written by Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagún, is one of the primary sources that allows us to understand the intellectual and cultural world of the Aztecs. Religious and spiritual legacy. The spiritual and religious practices of the Aztecs were deeply embedded in their worldview. Their gods, most famously Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, and Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, shaped their politics, their art, and their daily lives. Human sacrifice, often seen as one of the most controversial aspects of Aztec culture, was rooted in their belief that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world, and that humans needed to return this sacrifice to ensure the world's survival. Despite the brutality of these rituals, they were seen as a necessary part of maintaining the cosmic balance and ensuring the prosperity of the Aztec people. The Aztecs viewed their civilization as the center of the world, and their pantheon of gods was vast, with deities overseeing everything from agriculture to war. The Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan, dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, the rain god, was not just a place of worship, but a symbolic center of the Aztec universe. The rituals performed there, including offerings and sacrifices, were believed to sustain the gods and keep the universe in balance. Even though much of the Aztec religious system was replaced by Christianity after the Spanish conquest, many elements of their beliefs continued to influence the region. Catholicism became intertwined with indigenous practices, resulting in a syncretic blend of spiritual traditions that still exists in modern-day Mexico. Religious festivals such as Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, have roots in Aztec customs of honoring ancestors and the dead, a tradition that has been preserved and adapted through centuries of colonization. The destruction and transformation of an empire. The fall of the Aztec Empire and the destruction of Tenochtitlan were not just the collapse of a city or an empire, they were a cultural annihilation. The Thans sought to erase Aztec culture by destroying their religious structures, imposing Christianity, and suppressing indigenous languages and customs. Much of the knowledge of the Aztecs was lost, and their way of life was radically altered. However, the endurance of the Aztec people, their ability to adapt, and the survival of certain aspects of their culture ensured that the legacy of the Mexico would live on. The Spanish conquest led to the mass conversion of the indigenous population to Christianity, but it also led to the forced labor, exploitation, and decimation of the native peoples. Diseases such as smallpox, which the Spanish brought with them, ravaged the population, and the Aztecs, along with other indigenous groups, suffered immense loss. In the decades following the conquest, the indigenous population of Mexico plummeted by as much as yet, the Aztec people did not vanish completely. Their descendants are still present in Mexico today, contributing to the nation's rich cultural tapestry. Modern Mexico and the Aztec legacy. The legacy of the Aztecs can be seen in many aspects of modern Mexican culture. The country's capital, Mexico City, is built on the ruins of Tenochtitlan. The ancient city's streets, temples, and canals were buried beneath colonial-era buildings, but the foundations of the Aztec Empire remain in the heart of the city. Visitors to Mexico City can still visit the Templo Mayor, where the ruins of the Aztec capital have been excavated and are on display for the public. The Aztecs' achievements in art, architecture, and agriculture continue to be sources of pride for many Mexicans. In addition to the physical remnants of Aztec civilization, their cultural and religious influence is still evident in Mexican life. From the food such as tortillas, tamales, and chocolate, to the celebrations of indigenous holidays, elements of Aztec traditions have been absorbed into the fabric of modern Mexican culture. The use of Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, persists in certain regions of Mexico, and many place names, such as Mexico, from Mexico, the name the Aztecs gave to themselves, retain their Aztec roots. One of the most important symbols of Aztec legacy is the image of the eagle and serpent, which appears on the Mexican flag. This emblem, which comes from the Aztec creation myth in which the people saw an eagle perched on a cactus with a snake in its beak, represents the founding of Tenochtitlan, and is central to the identity of modern Mexico. It is a reminder of the Aztec people's resilience and their enduring presence in the country's cultural and historical consciousness. Reflection, the end of an empire and the persistence of culture. The story of the Aztec Empire is a tragic one, marked by the rapid rise of a civilization that was ultimately destroyed by foreign conquest. Yet, the end of the Aztec Empire did not signify the complete disappearance of their culture. Despite the violence and destruction of the Spanish conquest, the legacy of the Aztecs has persisted through the centuries. The Aztec people, their art, their language, and their traditions have survived in the hearts and minds of their descendants. What would it have been like to live in Tenochtitlan, to see the splendor of the Aztec capital, to walk through its temples, markets, and canals? What would it have been like to experience the terror and disorientation as the Spanish arrived and the empire began to unravel? The fall of the Aztec Empire was an immense tragedy, but it was also the beginning of a new chapter in history, one in which the resilience of the Aztec people and their culture would continue to shape the future of Mexico. The Great Fire of London, a city reborn from ashes deco, the spark that ignited a city. The year is 1666, and London, the bustling capital of England, is a city of contrast. The city is a centre of trade, culture, and politics, teeming with life, but also plagued by overcrowded streets, narrow alleys, and wooden buildings. The medieval cityscape, with its rickety structures, lacks the modern infrastructure needed to combat the ever-present dangers of fire. London's population has exploded in recent decades, and the rapid urban growth has led to poor living conditions. The city is ripe for disaster, and it's in this fragile state that one of the most devastating events in its history will unfold: the Great Fire of London. The fire started on the night of September 2, 1666, in a small bakery on Pudding Lane, near the heart of the city. The bakery's oven, already stoked with fire to bake the day's bread, was likely the source of the initial spark. But the conditions in London were such that this seemingly small fire would quickly spiral out of control. The narrow, tightly packed streets and wooden buildings, which were common throughout the city, created the perfect environment for a fire to spread rapidly. Additionally, the summer of 1666 had been particularly dry, with very little rain, leaving the timber buildings vulnerable to ignition. The flames spread quickly, and before long, they had engulfed entire blocks of the city. The fire was fed by strong winds that fanned the flames, causing the fire to jump from building to building. By the time the fire was finally brought under control, it had destroyed much of London, including famous landmarks, businesses, and thousands of homes. It would burn for 4 days, from September 2 until September 6, leaving much of the city in ruins. As the fire tore through London, the people of the city were left in a state of panic and chaos. The flames were so intense that they could be seen from miles away, lighting up the night sky and creating an eerie glow over the city. For those who lived within the city's walls, there was no escape. The fire took everything in its path, leaving behind only charred remnants of what had once been a thriving metropolis. London at the time was not only the heart of England's political and economic power, but also a city steeped in history. The fire destroyed iconic buildings including St. Paul's Cathedral, the Guildhall, and hundreds of churches, shops and businesses. The fire's ferocity meant that it left behind no trace of the vibrant city that had existed just days before. Yet in the wake of such devastation, something remarkable began to emerge. A new London, rebuilt from the ashes of its former self. But what caused the fire to spread so quickly? How was it that a small spark in a bakery could bring a city to its knees? And more importantly, How did London manage to rebuild itself after such a catastrophic event? To understand the full scale of the tragedy, we must first look at the city itself and the conditions that allowed the Great Fire to become such a massive disaster. The devastation and destruction. As the flames of the Great Fire of London raged through the city, the scale of the destruction became apparent. By the time the fire was finally contained on September 6, 1666, much of London had been reduced to ash. The fire had consumed approximately 87 churches, including the iconic St. Paul's Cathedral, 13,000 homes, and numerous shops and businesses. Almost 100,000 people were left homeless, and the damage to London's infrastructure was staggering. The fire had spread across 46 acres, or about a third of the city, leaving the heart of one of the most important cities in the world, a smouldering ruin. For the residents of London, the fire was a horrifying and surreal experience. People watched helplessly as their homes, their possessions, and their livelihoods were consumed by the inferno. The flames were so intense that it was said to have illuminated the night sky for miles around. The heat from the fire was so great that it melted lead on rooftops and caused the stones of buildings to crack. The panic was palpable as families fled their homes, many with little more than the clothes on their backs, trying to find shelter in the open fields or along the banks of the River Thames. Yet, as devastating as the fire was, it wasn't the first time that London had faced such a calamity. Fires had plagued the city for centuries, but none were as catastrophic as the one in 1660. The city had long lacked the proper firefighting infrastructure, with no organized fire brigades or regulations on building materials. This made the spread of the fire almost inevitable, as the city was designed in a way that allowed flames to leap from building to building with terrifying speed. The wind played a critical role in the fire's rapid spread. On the night the fire started, strong winds blew through the city, pushing the flames further and further into the heart of London. The fire quickly spread to neighbouring districts, engulfing vast swaths of the city within hours. The fire reached the city's most densely populated areas, where timber houses were tightly packed together, creating a perfect storm for the flames to spread. Firefighting efforts were also hampered by the lack of effective tools. Early fire brigades in London were rudimentary at best, using bucket brigades to transport water from nearby wells or the River Thames. These efforts were simply no match for the intensity of the fire. The devastation of the fire was not just physical, it was also psychological for those who had lost everything. The emotional toll was immense. The destruction of churches, businesses and homes was not just a loss of property, it was a loss of identity and community. Families were scattered, and many people found themselves forced to live in temporary shelters, struggling to survive in the aftermath of the disaster. The sense of loss was compounded by the fear that the city might never recover. One of the most tragic aspects of the fire was that it could have been prevented. Investigations into the cause of the fire later revealed that a simple spark from a bakery on Pudding Lane had ignited the inferno. The bakery's owner, Thomas Fariner, had failed to properly extinguish the oven before going to bed, and the fire quickly spread to nearby buildings. Though Fariner's bakery was at the epicenter, the conditions in the city, overcrowded, poorly constructed wooden buildings, and inadequate firefighting measures, allowed the flames to grow out of control. Despite the tremendous destruction, there were few casualties. Official records suggest that only 6 people died in the fire, though it is likely that the true number was higher. The reason for the low death toll, despite the scale of the fire, was the speed with which the residents of London evacuated. The fire spread so quickly that many people had no choice but to flee for their lives, and the lack of significant casualties can partly be attributed to the fact that people were able to escape before the flames reached them. However, the loss of property and the disruption to everyday life were far more widespread. The aftermath: rebuilding a city. The devastation caused by the Great Fire left London in ruins, but it also created a unique opportunity for the city to rebuild in a way that could prevent such a tragedy from happening again. The destruction of so much of London's infrastructure allowed architects, urban planners, and the government to rethink the design of the city, making it safer and more resilient in the face of future disasters. One of the first priorities after the fire was to clear the debris and start rebuilding the city. In the aftermath of the fire, King Charles II appointed a team of architects and surveyors to oversee the reconstruction. Christopher Wren, one of the most famous architects of the time, played a central role in the rebuilding of London. Wren's most notable contribution was the design of the new St. Paul's Cathedral, which would become a symbol of London's resilience and recovery. The cathedral, with its grand dome, became one of the most iconic buildings in London, and a testament to the city's ability to rebuild from the ashes. In addition to rebuilding important landmarks like St. Paul's Cathedral, the city's infrastructure was overhauled. New building regulations were introduced, requiring the use of brick and stone rather than timber, which made buildings less susceptible to fire. The city's narrow streets were widened, allowing for better access in the event of future fires, and fire breaks were created to prevent flames from spreading uncontrollably. Despite these efforts, the process of rebuilding was long and difficult. The economic strain of the fire was felt across the country, and it took years for London to fully recover. Much of the city's population had to live in temporary shelters, and businesses were forced to rebuild from scratch. The cost of rebuilding the city was immense, but the people of London persevered, determined to restore their city to its former glory. A new London: lessons learned from the fire. In the wake of the Great Fire, London began to emerge as a more modern, resilient city. The lessons learned from the fire shaped urban planning and construction practices for risk management. Fire prevention measures, such as the use of non-flammable materials in building construction, became standard practice. In the broader cultural sense, the fire became a defining moment for Londoners. It marked the resilience of the people of the city, who were able to rebuild and restore their capital despite the overwhelming loss and destruction. The fire, although tragic, highlighted the strength of the community and its ability to rise from the ashes. The fire also had an impact on the city's economy. Many of the wealthier families and businesses who had been affected by the fire began to reinvest in the city, helping to stimulate economic recovery. London's position as a centre of trade and commerce remained intact, and the city continued to grow, eventually becoming the global financial hub that it is today. The invention of the printing press, revolutionizing communication. A world before the press. Imagine a world where books are scarce, handwritten manuscripts are precious, and knowledge is available only to a select few. The written word, while powerful, is painstakingly copied by hand, and the cost of producing a single book is prohibitive for the vast majority of people. Before the 15th century, this was the reality in Europe. The spread of knowledge was slow, and information was controlled by the church, the aristocracy, and the few wealthy individuals who could afford to commission handwritten manuscripts. Ideas and discoveries were passed along through oral traditions or by a select group of scholars who had access to these rare manuscripts. Books, when they were available, were written on parchment or vellum, materials made from animal skins. These were expensive to produce, and the writing process was slow. A single copy of a book could take months, or even years, to create. As a result, the written word was confined to a small elite: monks in monasteries, scholars in universities, and the wealthy classes who could afford to own books. The masses, who were often illiterate, had little access to the written word and, consequently, little ability to engage with ideas or knowledge beyond their immediate surroundings. At the same time, oral communication remained a primary means of sharing stories, news, and ideas. Information traveled slowly, and the spread of new ideas was often limited by geography and social class. In this pre-printing press world, ideas had to rely on word of mouth, and this significantly slowed the pace of intellectual and cultural development. The ability to challenge old ideas, spread new concepts, and inspire widespread social change was limited by the inability to easily distribute information. This world, however, was on the brink of a revolution, one that would change not only how knowledge was shared, but how society itself would function. The invention of the printing press, a relatively simple device that used movable type to reproduce text, would eventually break down the barriers that limited access to knowledge, empowering individuals and communities to challenge the established norms and share ideas on a global scale. The stage was set for a revolution in communication that would reshape history. The birth of the printing revolution. In the mid-15th century, a relatively unknown German inventor named Johannes Gutenberg would change the course of history forever. Gutenberg's invention of the printing press around 1440 introduced a new way of producing books faster, cheaper, and more efficiently than ever before. It was a breakthrough that, though seemingly simple in concept, would go on to have a profound impact on European society and eventually the world. Before Gutenberg's press, books were laboriously handwritten by scribes. often monks in monasteries who would spend years copying religious text by hand. These books were rare and expensive, and as a result, only a small portion of the population had access to them. The written word was tightly controlled by religious and political elites, and the average person had little opportunity to engage with new ideas or challenge established authority. Gutenberg's genius lay in the development of movable type, a technology that allowed for the mass production of printed material. Movable type consisted of individual letters or characters that could be rearranged and reused to print pages of text. This was a significant improvement over earlier methods such as woodblock printing, where entire pages had to be carved out of wood. With movable type, printers could produce multiple copies of a single page of text in a fraction of the time it took to hand copy a manuscript. The first major work printed using movable type was Gutenberg's Bible, produced around 1455. This monumental achievement was not only a technical marvel but also a cultural one. The Gutenberg Bible was the first book to be mass-produced in Europe, and it demonstrated the power of the printing press to spread knowledge. The Bible, with its beautiful design and meticulous craftsmanship, marked the beginning of a new era in communication. Gutenberg's press was not an instant success, though. It took time for people to realize the full potential of the printing press. Initially, the press was used to print religious texts, but as the technology spread across Europe, it was quickly adapted for printing a wide variety of materials, including scientific works, philosophical treatises, political pamphlets, and literature. The press made it possible to disseminate ideas far more widely and quickly than ever before, and it became a tool for intellectual exchange and the spread of knowledge. The impact of the printing press was immediate and far-reaching. For the first time in history, books could be produced on a mass scale, making written material more affordable and accessible to a wider audience. The printing press broke down the barriers of access to knowledge that had previously been confined to the elite. Scholars, writers, and thinkers now had the ability to share their ideas with a broader audience, and ordinary people could finally have access to books and printed material. One of the earliest and most important effects of the printing press was its role in the spread of the Renaissance. The Renaissance, a cultural and intellectual movement that emphasized the rediscovery of classical knowledge, had been underway for some time. But the printing press made it possible for ideas to spread far beyond Italy, where the Renaissance had begun, and across Europe. Renaissance thinkers, philosophers, and scientists, such as Copernicus, Galileo, and Leonardo da Vinci, were able to share their ideas with a much larger audience. The press allowed for the rapid spread of new ideas and innovations in art, science, and philosophy, accelerating the cultural revolution that was transforming Europe. The printing press also had a profound impact on religion. In the early 16th century, Martin Luther's 95 Theses, a series of criticisms of the Catholic Church, were widely circulated thanks to the printing press. Luther's ideas spread quickly throughout Europe, sparking the Protestant Reformation and leading to a fundamental split within Christianity. Without the printing press, it is unlikely that Luther's ideas would have gained the traction they did. The ability to mass-produce pamphlets and books meant that ideas that challenged the status quo could now be disseminated quickly and effectively. In addition to its impact on religion, the printing press also played a crucial role in the rise of early modern science. Scientific works, such as those by Copernicus and later Galileo, were printed and distributed across Europe, challenging the traditional views of the cosmos and pushing humanity toward a new understanding of the natural world. The press helped to create a scientific community that was no longer bound by geographical or political barriers, allowing for the rapid exchange of ideas and the growth of scientific knowledge. The spread of knowledge and ideas. The success of the printing press quickly spread across Europe. By the end of the 15th century, printing presses were established in major cities like Venice, Paris, and London, and thousands of books had been printed. The press enabled the growth of literacy rates, as more people were able to access books and other printed materials. The spread of knowledge was no longer confined to a small group of elite scholars. It now reached a much broader audience. The press also played a crucial role in the development of journalism. In the 16th and 17th centuries, newspapers began to emerge, fueled by the same desire to share information quickly and efficiently. As literacy rates rose and more people began to read, the demand for news, both local and international, grew. The printing press allowed for the mass production of newspapers, pamphlets, and other periodicals, making it possible to distribute news to a wide audience on a regular basis. In addition to revolutionizing communication, the printing press had significant economic consequences. The production of books became a booming industry, and printers, publishers, and booksellers became powerful figures in European society. The rise of the print industry also had a lasting impact on education, as printed textbooks made learning more accessible to students and educators alike. The cultural and social impact of the printing press was profound. For centuries, the spread of knowledge had been limited by the painstaking process of copying books by hand, but with the advent of the printing press, books became more affordable and available to a wider audience. The press helped foster a new era of intellectual exchange, where ideas could be rapidly disseminated and debated across national and cultural boundaries. The printing press also played a role in the democratization of knowledge. Before the press, books were expensive and often controlled by religious or political authorities. The printing press allowed for a greater diversity of voices to be heard, from scientists and philosophers to political theorists and poets. It was a tool for social and intellectual progress, giving people the means to question authority, challenge dogma, and seek new ways of thinking. As the printing press spread, it also played a role in the rise of nationalism. Printed works, including books, pamphlets, and newspapers, helped to create a sense of shared identity and culture among people living in different regions. National languages began to emerge as print became more widespread, and the printed word helped to standardize language and grammar across countries. The press played a key role in shaping the modern concept of nation-states and national identity, a turning point in human history. The invention of the printing press was a turning point in human history. It revolutionized communication, transformed society, and helped to create the modern world. It allowed knowledge to spread more rapidly than ever before, paving the way for the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the scientific revolution. The printing press helped to break down barriers between the elite and the general public, making education, ideas, and information accessible to a much larger portion of the population. In many ways, the printing press can be seen as the precursor to the digital age. Just as the press made the written word accessible to the masses, modern technologies like the internet have made information more widely available than ever before. The ability to share ideas, challenge authority, and communicate across borders is something that traces its roots back to Gutenberg's invention. Would you have been able to imagine the far-reaching effects of the printing press if you had lived in 15th century Europe? How would the rapid spread of ideas have altered your worldview? And how would the accessibility of knowledge have changed the way you lived and learned? The long-term impact and legacy of the printing press. The advent of the printing press in the 15th century was a pivotal moment in history, and its impact extended far beyond the immediate changes it brought to communication and knowledge sharing. While the technology itself may have seemed relatively simple at the time, its long-term consequences were profound, shaping the course of Western civilization and eventually influencing global development. The Protestant Reformation, ideas spread like wildfire. One of the most significant ways the printing press changed history was by amplifying the voices of reformers like Martin Luther. Prior to the press, ideas that challenged the dominant religious and political authorities could be easily suppressed or contained. But with the ability to mass-produce pamphlets, books, and other printed materials, Luther's writings spread throughout Europe with astonishing speed. In 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, Germany, sparking the Protestant Reformation. Initially, his objections to the Catholic Church's practices, especially the sale of indulgences, might have been dismissed by church officials, but the press ensured that his message reached a wide audience. Within weeks, Luther's ideas were being printed and distributed across Europe, leading to a groundswell of support for his critiques of the Church. The Reformation, which challenged centuries of Catholic doctrine, was fueled by the printing press. The ability to produce and distribute Luther's ideas helped him find followers among the clergy, intellectuals, and common people alike. By the 1520s, his writings were available in multiple languages, and the Protestant movement had gained enough momentum to challenge the Catholic Church's authority. The press made it possible for religious and political ideas to spread rapidly and widely, undermining the power of the Church, and eventually leading to the fragmentation of Christianity into numerous denominations. Beyond Luther, other reformers, such as John Calvin and Huldrych Zwingli, also used the printing press to promote their ideas. In the process, the press not only facilitated religious upheaval, but also paved the way for the development of modern concepts of individualism, free thought, and religious freedom. The Reformation ultimately led to the creation of new religious movements, reshaping the landscape of European society and politics for centuries to come. The Age of Enlightenment, philosophical and scientific advancements. The printing press also played a crucial role in the Age of Enlightenment, a period of intellectual and cultural development in the 17th and 18th. Thinkers and philosophers like John Locke, Voltaire, Immanuel Kant, and Montesquieu were able to spread their ideas about government, reason, liberty, and human rights across Europe through printed works. The press allowed for the rapid exchange of ideas and debates, which sparked political, social, and intellectual movements that fundamentally changed the way people thought about society and governance. One of the most important aspects of the Enlightenment was its emphasis on reason and science. The press allowed for the rapid dissemination of scientific discoveries, works of mathematics, and new philosophies that challenged long-held ideas. The works of astronomers like Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler, who had once been confined to the intellectual elite, were now available to a wider public. The printing press helped spread the scientific revolution, which questioned the geocentric model of the universe and laid the foundation for modern scientific inquiry. In many ways, the Enlightenment would not have been possible without the printing press. By allowing new ideas to circulate quickly and widely, the press helped to create an environment in which questioning authority, challenging tradition, and exploring new ways of thinking became possible. Enlightenment thinkers used the press to advocate for civil rights, democracy, and equality, which would eventually lead to political revolutions, such as the American and French Revolution. The spread of Enlightenment ideas through printed material fostered the development of the modern democratic ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which continue to influence political thought today. The rise of journalism and mass media. The printing press also had a transformative effect on journalism, which became a powerful tool for shaping public opinion. With the rise of printed newspapers and pamphlets, it became possible for news to be disseminated widely and quickly. Early newspapers, such as the London Gazette, founded in 1665, began to report on current events, offering readers insight into political developments, wars, and other important matters of the day. For the first time in history, people could read about events happening far beyond their local communities. Journalism provided a platform for ideas to be debated publicly, and it helped create an informed citizenry that was increasingly involved in matters of governance and politics. Printed materials, whether in the form of newspapers, pamphlets, or books, became essential tools for shaping public opinion and pushing forward social and political movements. In the centuries following the invention of the printing press, the role of the media only grew in importance. Newspapers, magazines, and eventually radio and television became central to the development of public discourse. Today, the internet and digital media continue the tradition of mass communication, but all of it owes its existence to the printing press and the revolution it sparked. The rise of literacy and education. The printing press also had a profound impact on literacy and education, with books and printed materials becoming more widely available and affordable. Education was no longer confined to the elite. Schools and universities began to flourish, and a growing number of people had access to reading and writing. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the rise of printing coincided with the expansion of education in Europe. Protestant reformers, in particular, encouraged the spread of literacy, believing that individuals should be able to read the Bible for themselves. This helped fuel the growth of literacy rates across Europe, which in turn helped foster the development of a more educated and informed populace. As literacy spread, so too did new ideas about government, society, and the role of the individual. The press contributed to the creation of a more egalitarian society, in which knowledge was no longer the exclusive domain of the aristocracy and clergy. People from all walks of life, including the middle and lower classes, could now access books, pamphlets, and newspapers, which opened up new opportunities for personal growth, intellectual development, and social mobility. A lasting legacy. The impact of the printing press on history is immeasurable. From its role in the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment, to its influence on journalism, science, and education, the printing press transformed the world in ways that continue to shape our lives today. The press broke the monopoly on knowledge held by the elite and allowed ideas to flow freely, helping to spark revolutions, challenge existing power structures, and spread new ways of thinking. As we reflect on the revolution sparked by the printing press, we must recognize how it laid the groundwork for the modern world. Just as the printing press changed the landscape of communication in the 15th century, modern technologies like the internet and social media have revolutionized how we share and consume information today. The ability to disseminate ideas quickly and widely, to engage in public discourse, and to challenge authority is a legacy that traces its roots back to Gutenberg's invention. Would you have imagined in the world of the 15th century that something as simple as movable type could change history so dramatically? How would it have felt to suddenly have access to ideas and knowledge that were previously out of reach? And how might our world today be different if the printing press had never been invented? The discovery of electricity, lighting the path to the modern world, a world before electric light. Before the discovery of electricity, the world was a much darker place. The days were defined by the rise and set of the sun, and once the sun dipped below the horizon, life slowed down. Without electric light, evenings were filled with the soft glow of candles, lanterns, and oil lamps, and people were forced to adapt to the rhythms of daylight. As a result, much of human activity, from work to socializing, was confined to the daytime, and the night was often a time of rest, or, in many cases, uncertainty. The use of fire as a source of light had been around for millennia, but it was far from ideal. Candles and oil lamps provided only dim light, and the fire hazard was ever present. In the early 19th century, this changed dramatically. The discovery of electricity and the subsequent development of electrical lighting would revolutionize daily life, not just by brightening the world, but by altering the very fabric of human activity. Before the discovery of electricity, people had long known about other natural phenomena, like magnetism and static electricity, but these were considered oddities or curiosities. The idea that electricity could be harnessed and used to power machines, light cities, or transform industries was a distant dream. Yet, this dream began to take shape in the late 18th century, with the work of pioneers like Benjamin Franklin, Alessandro Volta, and Michael Faraday. Franklin, in the mid-1700s, famously conducted his kite experiment, demonstrating that lighting was a form of electricity. This groundbreaking discovery was one of the first steps toward understanding electrical phenomena. But while Franklin's experiments were important, it was Volta's invention of the first chemical battery in 1800 that truly marked the beginning of a new era. Volta's battery allowed for the steady flow of electric current and paved the way for future developments in electrical science. As the 19th century progressed, the understanding of electricity continued to deepen. But it wasn't until the later part of the century that scientists and inventors began to recognize the practical applications of electricity. By the time Thomas Edison began his work on electrical lighting in the late 1870s, the world was ready for a revolution that would change how people lived, worked, and interacted with their environment. The age of invention. As the 19th century progressed, the fascination with electricity grew, and so did the race to harness its power. Several key figures, including Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, and Michael Faraday, were instrumental in turning electricity from a scientific curiosity into a practical, usable force that could change the world. The development of electric lighting would become one of the most transformative achievements in history, allowing people to extend their days beyond the setting sun, revolutionizing industries, and reshaping the way societies function. The light bulb. Edison's triumph. The journey to electric lighting was long and complex, involving numerous inventors and scientists across Europe and the United States. However, it was Thomas Edison's development of the practical incandescent light bulb in the late 1870s that would mark a turning point in the history of electricity. Edison, a prolific inventor, was obsessed with creating a reliable, long-lasting light source that could replace the dangerous and inefficient gas lamps and candles that had been in use for centuries. He experimented with a variety of materials, looking for the perfect filament that would glow brightly when electricity passed through it, but would also last for a reasonable amount of time. After many failed attempts, in 1879, Edison succeeded in developing a carbon filament that could burn for up to 11200 hours, finally making the incandescent bulb viable. Edison's light bulb didn't just change how people lit their homes and workplaces, it changed the rhythm of daily life. Electric light allowed businesses to operate longer hours, facilitated the development of industries that were once confined to daylight, and made evening activities safer and more efficient. The light bulb was one of Edison's most famous inventions, but his work didn't stop there. Edison's system was based on direct current, DC, which would eventually become a major point of contention in the battle for electrical dominance. Nikola Tesla, alternating current, and the battle of the currents. While Edison's development of the incandescent bulb was revolutionary, his system of electrical distribution was limited by the technology of the time. Edison's direct current DC system required power stations to be located relatively close to the users they served. The energy loss over long distances made the system inefficient, especially for larger cities or for widespread use. Enter Nikola Tesla, an inventor and electrical engineer who worked for Edison early in his career but would later become his competitor. Tesla's work on alternating current, AC, revolutionized electricity distribution by allowing the transmission of electricity over long distances without the significant loss of energy that occurred with DC. Tesla's AC system used a rotating magnetic field to create a constant reversal of current, which made it more efficient for long-distance power transmission. The War of Currents, as it became known, pitted Edison's DC system against Tesla's AC system. Edison, fiercely protective of his own inventions, launched a campaign to discredit AC, claiming it was dangerous. Tesla, with the support of industrialist George Westinghouse, continued to champion the superiority of alternating current. The battle culminated in 1893, when Tesla's AC system was chosen to power the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, marking a major victory for Tesla and AC. A few years later, in 1896, Tesla's AC system was used to power the first large-scale hydroelectric power station at Niagara Falls, a project that would cement AC as the dominant method of electrical transmission. Tesla's contributions to electrical engineering, particularly his work on alternating current, paved the way for the modern electrical grid, which would make electricity accessible to millions of people across the world. The social and economic impact of electric lighting. The widespread adoption of electric lighting had immediate social and economic effects. Electric light dramatically altered how people lived and worked. For the first time in history, people could extend their working hours well into the night. Factories, shops and offices could remain open after dark, increasing productivity and changing the nature of labor. Nighttime became more vibrant, with electric streetlights providing safer passage through urban streets. The rise of electric lighting also played a key role in the rapid expansion of cities during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As cities grew, so did the need for reliable and efficient lighting to illuminate streets and public spaces. Electric streetlights became a symbol of progress and modernity, and their adoption in cities across Europe and North America helped to transform urban landscapes. Public spaces became safer, and the fear of darkness, which had plagued societies for centuries, began to dissipate. Electric lighting also had significant cultural and social effects. It changed how people organized their time. Social gatherings, concerts, theater performances, and public events could now take place after dark. The ability to extend daylight hours revolutionized the entertainment industry and brought about the rise of nighttime leisure activities, from the theater to public entertainment and socializing. Electric lighting was no longer just about practical use. It became a part of modern life, making the night an extension of the day and creating new possibilities for work, leisure, and cultural expression. Electricity in industry and technology. The implications of electricity were felt across many sectors beyond lighting. In the industrial world, the ability to use electrical power for machinery was transformative. Factories that had relied on steam engines or manual labor could now harness electricity to drive more efficient machinery, resulting in higher productivity and reduced costs. Electrical motors powered by AC or DC began replacing steam engines in factories, marking the beginning of a new industrial era. The rise of electricity also sparked innovations in other industries. In the realm of communication, electricity paved the way for telegraphy and eventually the telephone, both of which relied on electrical systems for transmitting messages over long distances. The telegraph, in particular, allowed for the near-instantaneous transmission of information across continents, drastically reducing communication times and helping to knit the world together in new ways. Electricity was also fundamental to the development of new technology, from the electric motor to the development of the electric car, which in its earliest forms existed alongside gasoline-powered models. The promise of electrical power led to innovations that would shape the future. Electricity enabled the invention of early computers, radios, and televisions, laying the groundwork for the technological advancements that would define the 20th and 21st centuries. A new world of possibilities. Electricity became the driving force of modern civilization. The world that emerged from the 19th century was one in which the boundaries of what was possible were being constantly redefined. From lighting cities to powering factories, electricity became a symbol of progress and a driving force behind the transformation of everyday life. It allowed for the development of new technologies, innovations, and industries that would shape the global economy. Today, it's difficult to imagine life without electricity. It powers our homes, our workplaces, and our devices, and it drives the technological infrastructure of the modern world. The discovery and development of electricity have had lasting effects on every aspect of society: social, cultural, economic, and political. The ability to harness electricity has revolutionized the way we live, work, and interact with the world around us. As we reflect on the journey from the humble beginnings of electrical discovery to the present day, we can see that electricity has not only brightened our nights, but has illuminated the path to a new era of human possibility. What might the world have looked like if the discovery of electricity had not taken place? How would our lives have been different without the fundamental changes brought by the ability to light up the world? The rise of the internet, connecting the world to seeds of the digital revolution. The world before the internet was vastly different from the world we know today. Communication was slower, information was more difficult to access, and people's interactions were confined to physical spaces or limited to the technology of the time: telephones, written letters, and books. It was a world that moved at a different pace, and while technology had certainly advanced throughout the 20th century, there was nothing that could compare to the sweeping change that would be brought by the internet. The story of the internet's rise begins in the 1960s, when the seeds of this digital revolution were first planted. At that time, computers were massive machines used mainly by governments, universities, and large corporations. They were expensive, hard to operate, and not accessible to the average person. But even then, scientists and engineers had begun to imagine a world in which computers could be linked together, allowing them to share information and communicate across vast distances. One of the key pioneers of the early internet was J.C.R. Licklider, a computer scientist at MIT who in the early 1960s envisioned an interconnected network of computers. Licklider's idea was that computers could be used to share information in a way that would eliminate the need for physical libraries or centralized knowledge repositories. He imagined a galactic network of computers that could communicate in real time, allowing people to access information and interact with one another, no matter where they were located. Licklider's vision, while grand, would take years to come to fruition. But as the 1960s progressed, other key developments laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the internet. In 1969, the US Department of Defense funded a project called ARPANET, which was designed to connect various research institutions and universities using a packet switching system, a method of breaking down data into small packets and sending them across multiple routes to avoid disruption in case of failure. This system would eventually become the backbone of the modern internet. The success of ARPANET in the early 1970s proved that it was possible to link computers together for the exchange of information. Soon other networks were being created, and the idea of a global network began to seem more achievable. However, it wasn't until the 1980s that the internet started to take shape in a way that resembled what we know today. The development of the TCP/IP protocol, a standardized way of transmitting data across networks, allowed different networks to communicate with one another, creating the first true internet, the creation of the World Wide Web. The real turning point came in the early 1990s, with the creation of the World Wide Web. While the internet had existed in various forms for decades, it wasn't until the web was invented by Tim Berners-Lee, a British computer scientist, that the internet became something that could be accessed and used by the general public. Berners-Lee developed the HTTP protocol, an HTML language, which allowed documents and information to be linked together in a way that could be viewed in graphical form using web browsers. In 1991, Berners-Lee launched the first website, which was hosted on a server at CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, where he was working at the time. The web allowed people to browse and share information in a much more intuitive and user-friendly way than had ever been possible before. Suddenly, anyone with access to a computer and an internet connection could browse websites, send emails, and interact with others across the world. The creation of the web fundamentally changed the internet from a niche research tool to a platform for the global exchange of information. Websites began to proliferate, and the world's first search engines, such as Yahoo and Alta Vista, made it easier to find information online. In 1994, the first online store, Amazon, was launched, and other early internet businesses like eBay and Craigslist followed. The web opened up a world of new possibilities, enabling commerce, entertainment, education, and social interaction on a scale never before imagined. The internet's explosion and the dot-com boom. The mid to late 1990s saw the internet explode in popularity. What had once been a tool for academics, scientists, and government agencies became something that millions of people around the world were eager to use. The rise of the personal computer, the expansion of broadband internet connections, and the proliferation of internet service providers, ISPs, made it possible for people in homes and offices to connect to the web at unprecedented speeds. By the late 1990s, the internet had transformed from a niche interest into a mainstream necessity. The early days of the internet were marked by a frenzy of innovation and investment. Companies and entrepreneurs rushed to build websites, launch online businesses, and take advantage of the new digital economy. This period, known as the dot-com boom, saw the rapid rise of companies like Amazon, Google, and eBay, which would go on to become some of the most successful and influential companies of the 20th. The boom also led to the creation of countless other internet-based businesses, from content sites to e-commerce platforms, all seeking to capture a piece of the growing online market. However, the dot-com boom was not without its pitfall. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a speculative bubble developed as investors poured money into internet-based companies, many of which were unprofitable or untested. When the bubble burst in 2000, many companies collapsed, and billions of dollars in investment were lost. Despite this, the long-term impact of the dot-com era was profound. It helped to establish the internet as a central part of the global economy, and it laid the groundwork for the next phase of the digital revolution. The internet becomes a global phenomenon. By the early 2000s, despite the crash of the dot-com bubble, the internet had solidified its place as an indispensable part of modern life. What started as a network for researchers and academics had become a global phenomenon, connecting people from all corners of the world in ways previously unimaginable. The technological advancements and innovations that followed would transform not just commerce, but how people communicated, learned, worked, and even thought about their identity in a connected world. The rise of social media, connecting people. While the early internet was primarily a platform for information sharing, the mid-2000s marked the beginning of a profound shift towards social interaction online. Platforms like Facebook, which launched in 2004, and MySpace, which preceded it, created spaces where people could connect with friends, share updates, and build online communities. For the first time, the internet wasn't just about looking up information, it was about people interacting with each other in real time, forging relationships, and forming networks that transcended geographical boundaries. Facebook, originally conceived as a social networking site for college students, quickly expanded beyond the campus setting. By 2006, it was open to anyone with an email address, and soon after, it became a central part of everyday life for millions of people around the world. The creation of Facebook groups, event planning, and status updates transformed how people communicated, both personally and professionally. People could now interact with friends, family, and acquaintances, regardless of distance, and businesses began to recognize the potential of social media as a marketing tool. Other platforms such as Twitter, launched in 2006, and LinkedIn, founded in 2002, grew in prominence, offering new ways for individuals to communicate with a wider audience or network professionally. By the 2010s, social media was no longer just a tool for personal connections. It was a central pillar of political campaigns, social movements, and global activism. Twitter played a role in revolutions in the Middle East, and Facebook helped coordinate grassroots movements such as the Arab Spring, The rise of social media changed not just the way people interacted with one another, but also how they consumed information. Traditional news outlets found themselves competing with citizen journalism and social media platforms that allowed anyone with an internet connection to share news, opinions, and experience. The line between personal and public life blurred as people documented their every moment online, transforming the way people viewed privacy and identity. The expansion of e-commerce, from books to everything. Alongside the rise of social media, the internet also reshaped the global economy. E-commerce, the buying and selling of goods and services online, became a driving force in the economy. Companies like Amazon and eBay, which had started out as online bookstores and auction sites, quickly expanded into vast digital marketplaces, where almost anything could be bought and sold. Amazon, founded by Jeff Bezos in 1994, was one of the earliest and most successful pioneers in the e-commerce revolution. Originally an online bookstore, Amazon began selling a wider variety of products and revolutionized how people shop. By the 2000s, Amazon had become a global powerhouse, using innovative technologies like recommendation algorithms, user reviews, and fast shipping to create an entirely new retail experience. The company's success was built on the ability to reach customers worldwide, providing a seamless shopping experience that combined convenience, selection, and price. eBay, launched in 1995 by Pierre Omidyar, was another e-commerce pioneer. It started as an online auction platform where individuals could buy and sell second-hand goods. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, eBay had evolved into a global marketplace where millions of transactions took place every day. eBay's focus on peer-to-peer sales, where individuals could sell directly to each other, introduced a new way of thinking about commerce and disrupted traditional retail models. By the 2010s, e-commerce had become a global force, with major retailers like Walmart and Target establishing strong online presences, and smaller businesses reaching global customers through platforms like Shopify. The rise of mobile commerce, or m-commerce, further accelerated the growth of e-commerce, allowing consumers to shop from anywhere with an internet connection. Streaming and the digital media revolution. Another area where the internet revolutionized daily life was in entertainment. The shift from physical media to digital content reshaped how people consumed movies, music, books, and television shows. The early days of the internet were marked by the rise of illegal file-sharing services like Napster, but the legal and commercial adoption of digital media soon followed. Streaming services, which offered instant access to music, video, and TV shows, quickly became the new norm. In 2005, YouTube was founded, and within a few years, it had become the dominant platform for user-generated video content. By allowing anyone with an internet connection to upload and share videos, YouTube helped democratize video production and consumption, turning ordinary people into content creators and leading to the rise of viral videos and online influencers. Today, YouTube has over 2 billion monthly active users, with billions of hours of video watched every day. In the world of music, streaming services like Spotify, founded in 2006, changed the way people listen to music. Rather than purchasing individual songs or albums, users could now stream millions of tracks for a monthly subscription fee. Spotify's personalized playlists, along with its ability to offer music on demand, disrupted the traditional music industry, challenging record labels and reshaping how music was produced, distributed, and consumed. Streaming services also reshaped the television and movie industries. Netflix, which began as a DVD rental service, transitioned to streaming in 2007, and by the 2010s it had become a global entertainment giant. Netflix's success helped popularize the idea of binge-watching entire seasons of shows in one sitting, changing the way people interacted with TV. The rise of original content on streaming platforms, including shows like House of Cards, Stranger Things, and The Crown, made streaming services a direct competitor to traditional cable television and movie theaters. The Internet of Things. Connecting the physical world. As the 21st century progressed, the internet began to expand beyond computers and smartphones. The Internet of Things, IoT, a network of everyday devices connected to the internet, began to emerge, from smart thermostats and light bulbs to connected refrigerators and wearable fitness trackers. IoT has revolutionized how people interact with their environment. Devices that were once standalone products are now part of a vast, interconnected digital ecosystem, enabling users to control their homes, health, and personal devices with a simple tap or voice command. The rise of IoT has been accompanied by advancements in artificial intelligence, AI, and machine learning, which allow devices to become smarter and more intuitive. For example, AI-powered virtual assistants like Amazon's Alexa, Google Assistant, and Apple's Siri can help users manage their daily lives, from setting alarms to controlling smart home devices, and even answering questions or providing directions. The integration of AI into everyday products has brought the world closer to the vision of a fully connected, automated society. The Internet's global reach and its challenges. As the Internet has expanded globally, it has brought both opportunities and challenges. The Internet has bridged geographic divides, creating a more interconnected world where people can work, learn, and communicate across borders. The ability to access information from anywhere, at any time, has empowered individuals and businesses alike. It has fueled the rise of e-commerce, social media, education, and entertainment, reshaping how societies function on every level. However, this global connectivity has also brought new challenges, including concerns over privacy, cybersecurity, misinformation, and the digital divide. The widespread use of social media and online platforms has raised questions about data security, the impact of online harassment, and the role of big tech companies in shaping public discourse. The Internet has also exposed the gap between those with access to digital technologies and those without, highlighting the need for greater access to technology in underserved regions. Despite these challenges, the Internet continues to evolve and transform the world. It has connected billions of people, created new industries, and opened up unprecedented opportunities for innovation. The digital revolution powered by the Internet is ongoing, and as technology advances, so too will the ways in which we interact with each other and the world around us. Reflection: a connected future. As we look back on the history of the Internet, it's difficult to imagine life without it. The Internet has fundamentally changed how we communicate, work, and learn. It has democratized information, connected distant parts of the world, and made global collaboration easier than ever. But what will the future hold as the Internet continues to evolve? Will new technologies, such as virtual reality, or even more advanced AI, reshape how we interact with the digital world? How will the next generation of the Internet continue to connect people and create new possibilities for the world? The Internet today and the future ahead. The Internet today is a vast, complex network that touches almost every aspect of modern life, from socializing and entertainment to business, education, and healthcare. The Internet has become not just a tool but the backbone of much of society. Its global reach has transformed economies, influenced politics, and created new forms of interaction that were previously unimaginable. As we look at the present and into the future, it's clear that the Internet will continue to evolve, bringing both opportunities and challenges. The Internet as a tool for globalization. One of the most transformative impacts of the Internet has been its role in globalization. The ability to connect people across borders in real time has reshaped business, culture, and communication in unprecedented ways. Companies can now operate on a global scale, selling products to customers across the world without the need for physical stores in every country. E-commerce giants like Amazon and Alibaba, which operate entirely online, have revolutionized retail, making it possible for consumers to buy almost anything from anywhere. The rise of digital platforms like Uber, Airbnb, and others has made it easier for people to access services and resources that once required face-to-face interaction. These platforms have changed the way people travel, work, and even socialize, all thanks to the power of the Internet. In many ways, the Internet has allowed businesses and individuals to become part of a truly global economy, with goods, services, and people moving around the world faster than ever. Beyond business, the Internet has also fostered a global culture. Social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter have connected people from different cultures and backgrounds, allowing them to share their lives, experiences, and ideas. In many ways, the Internet has created a global village, where news travels instantly, and movements and trends can go viral within hours. It has facilitated cross-cultural exchanges that were previously difficult or impossible, leading to a more interconnected and interdependent world. However, the benefits of globalization brought about by the Internet and not without complications. The rise of online platforms has contributed to the decline of traditional industries, creating job displacement and social disruption. The digital divide, which separates those with access to the internet and technology from those without, remains a significant challenge, particularly in developing regions. While the internet has created opportunities for some, it has also exacerbated inequality in others, raising questions about the future of work, education, and access to technology. The role of social media in shaping society. Social media has had a profound effect on how people interact with each other and how they engage with information. Platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube have become central to the way people communicate, express their identities, and share information. Social media has democratized information sharing, giving ordinary people the ability to voice their opinions, share their stories, and connect with others across the world. Social media has also become a powerful tool for activism and social change. Movements like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and the Arab Spring were fueled by the viral nature of social media, where messages and calls to action spread rapidly across borders. Social media platforms have allowed marginalized voices to be heard and have provided a platform for organizing protests, raising awareness, and demanding justice. This ability to mobilize people on a global scale has created a new form of civic engagement, where individuals can make a difference simply by sharing their thoughts online. However, social media also has its darker side. The rise of misinformation, cyberbullying, and online hate speech has become a major concern. The spread of fake news, particularly on platforms like Facebook and Twitter, has been linked to political polarization, social unrest, and even violence. The algorithms that govern social media platforms often prioritize sensational and emotionally charged content, which can lead to the spread of harmful or misleading information. Moreover, social media has become a tool for surveillance, both by governments and private corporations, raising concerns about privacy, data security, and the erosion of civil liberties. In response to these issues, governments, tech companies, and civil society have begun to grapple with the role of regulation, data protection, and the responsibility of online platforms in preventing harm. The future of social media will likely involve greater accountability, transparency, and measures to combat misinformation, but the challenges are significant, and the debate is ongoing. The Internet of Things, a fully connected world. The rise of the Internet of Things, IoT, has brought about a new phase in the evolution of the Internet, where everyday objects are connected to the web, from smart thermostats and refrigerators to wearable devices like fitness trackers. The IoT has created a world where physical objects are increasingly becoming smart and able to communicate with each other. These devices collect data, learn from it, and can be controlled remotely through apps or voice commands. The Internet of Things promises to revolutionize industries like healthcare, transportation, and urban planning. In healthcare, IoT devices can monitor patients remotely, sending real-time data to doctors and healthcare providers, improving diagnosis and treatment. In transportation, IoT technology is enabling the development of self-driving cars, making roads safer and more efficient. In smart cities, IoT is being used to monitor traffic, manage energy consumption, and improve public services, making urban living more sustainable. Another transformative aspect of the Internet's evolution is the rise of artificial intelligence, AI. AI has the potential to revolutionize nearly every industry by automating tasks, analyzing vast amounts of data, and making predictions in ways that humans cannot. From self-driving cars to personal assistants like Siri and Alexa, AI is becoming an integral part of how we interact with technology. In healthcare, AI is being used to analyze medical images, predict disease outbreaks, and develop personalized treatments. In business, AI is helping companies improve customer service, optimize supply chains, and make data-driven decisions. AI is also playing a major role in scientific research, from drug discovery to climate modeling, accelerating progress in fields that once took decades to advance. However, the rise of AI also raises ethical and societal concerns. Issues such as job displacement, privacy, bias in algorithms, and the potential for AI to be used in harmful ways are all areas of concern. As AI continues to develop, it will be essential to ensure that its benefits are distributed equitably and that its risks are managed responsibly. The future of the Internet, a world of possibilities. As we look to the future, The internet will continue to evolve in ways we can only begin to imagine. The ongoing development of 5G networks promises faster speeds and more reliable connections, enabling new possibilities for IoT, AI, and other technologies. Virtual reality (VR) and augmented reality (AR) are poised to change how we work, learn, and entertain ourselves, creating immersive digital experiences that could alter the way we interact with the world. However, with these new possibilities come new challenges. The future of the internet will require ongoing attention to issues like privacy, data security, digital literacy, and the regulation of online platforms. As the world becomes more connected, it is